I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming this morning. My name is Jordan Esser. I'm with the DuPage County Health Department and the coordinator of the Prevention Leadership Team. And we're really excited to be hosting this important and very timely event for you this morning. Before I hand it over to our speaker and jump into the policy writing stuff, I wanted to just share a little bit of an overview of our coalition. And share some of the youth data, because I know a lot of you are from businesses, HR, but some of you might work with teens or you're hiring kids out of high school or even college. So I wanted to kind of set the stage for you this morning. So the main goal of the Prevention Leadership Team, or the PLT, is to focus on preventing substance use and increasing mental health among youth in DuPage County. And we try to do that mostly through education and advocating for prevention policies. We get a lot of our data from the Illinois Youth Survey. So we have over 50% of public middle schools and almost 60% of public high schools that participate in this survey every other year. It's an anonymous, self-reported survey by the teens in these schools, and it asks them about a number of protective and risk factors. I pull out the substance use and mental health stuff. Today I'm just gonna share short snippets of the substance use data with you. But if you're interested, the DuPage County full report is available online. So you can see here, 8th grade is in blue, 10th grade is in orange, and 12th grade is in gray. The substances that our kids in DuPage County are reporting using over a 30-day period. So in the past 30 days, have you used any of these substances? So you can see the top three are alcohol, e-cigarettes, and marijuana. And alcohol has been the number one most commonly reported among youth for some time, but it's only been in recent years that e-cigarettes has jumped to number 2. And that's not very shocking. We hear a lot about it in the news right now. It's an epidemic, according to our Surgeon General. But marijuana is actually tied for second when it comes to 12th graders. So nearly a quarter of DuPage County 12th graders have used marijuana or e-cigarettes in the past 30 days. I also wanted to pull out perception of risk. So this is something else our coalition looks at. The more risk somebody associates with something, the less likely they are to do that thing. So we want our kids to see great risk in using substances, because there is a great risk for them with their growing bodies and developing brains. But you can see here that a big portion of 8th through 12th graders see no risk or little risk in using e-cigarettes or marijuana. And these are the two big things right now that we are inundated with. So between alcohol, tobacco, e-cigarettes, and now marijuana and kratom, if you're familiar, I have a sheet on the table. Emerging on the scene, kids today are inundated with more addictive substances than ever before. So it's very important that we provide education and that we advocate for strong prevention policies. And in your workplaces, that's a great place to start. I also pulled out this quick slide. So the kids on the survey were asked, for marijuana, your method of use. How are you using marijuana? And vaping is the second most common method of use among marijuana users. So I don't want you to see 64%. Of the kids that said, I've used marijuana in the past 30 days, the second most common method is they vaped it. So that's concerning. So that's just a very quick overview snippet of our coalition. I hope you guys see us as a resource for your businesses and your communities. We are happy to provide presentations, advocate for prevention policies, provide you with best practice prevention policies to implement in your communities and your workplaces. I will have a stack of business cards on the table. If you want to grab them on your way out, don't hesitate to reach out to me with questions. All right, and with that, I'll introduce our speaker, Joe McGuire. Joe is the founding chairman and board of directors for the National Drug and Alcohol Screening Association, and she advocates for safe and drug-free workplaces worldwide. She's also the CEO and president of 5 Minutes of Courage, where she uses her experience as a subject matter expert to focus on the impact of legal marijuana policies on young people, families, workplaces, and communities. So we really do have the expert of the experts here today, and I'm glad she's here. So Joe, I'll hand it over to you. I'll pull up your presentation.
I'm just going to give you kind of a little overview of how the day is going to go so that you know. First, I'm going to give you updates on contemporary marijuana and the impact to drugs in the workplace in general, the outcomes that we are seeing in the workplace in Colorado specifically, and then some suggestions, some overall suggestions for policies, which I'm going to touch on lightly because I'll get much more in depth in those in the second half of our presentation. And they're not equally divided in half, it's more like a third and then 2/3, but anyway, two different presentations. Then in the second piece, we will go through why have a policy, why it matters, and you need to know this because it's going to matter in writing, reworking, reviewing, whatever stage you are in your policy. This is really going to matter to set the stage for you. And then we're going to go through a policy, a short policy and a long policy, every step so that I can explain to you, this is why this matters, and this is what you can and cannot do. This is what is completely up to you and your prerogative. I'll answer questions. Of course, I do not have every answer, but if I don't have the answer, I will tell you that. And then that's kind of how we'll do it. And at the end of this day, not this 24 hours, but at the end of this time together, if you have provided Jordan with your email address, I will send you my 2 boilerplate policies that we are using in this presentation, the short one and the long one, so that if you're starting from scratch or you want to compare them side by side or whatever that looks like, you can have that language that we've used today. Okay? Sound good? All right. So what I want to know up front so that I just kind of have an understanding of the audience, how many of you have DOT employees? Raise your hand. Okay, a few. So the rest are non-DOT. How many of you have non-DOT employees that you consider safety sensitive? Raise your hand. Kind of, sort of, okay. All right, how many would you consider you don't have any safety sensitive, you're like office workers or whatever? Okay, great. All right, that's going to matter. All right, just trying to decide how much of my background you need to know. I don't know if it's important or not, but I was in prevention for many years, and then prevention is all grant funded, 100%. And then grant money died up and went away when the economy tanked, and the organization I was working for, which I thought I'd work with for the rest of my life and loved it and all of that stuff, said, we have to cut everybody. It was a really sad day, but they actually, in doing so, they survived and they're still growing. It's wonderful, but one of our board members hired me to continue the prevention work, which I was so excited about. And the prevention work that was going to be my piece was drug and alcohol prevention in the community, particularly aimed at youth. And I knew her company did some drug and alcohol testing, but that was kind of like an also. I didn't realize for several months that I would do the drug and alcohol testing. And I thought it was super special, didn't have to do that. So it was really kind of a shock to me, and I was like, I don't know that I'm gonna do that. And she actually sent me to a conference to get trained and certified as a collector, which I had no idea there was such a thing. And while I was there, in that training class to become a certified collections professional, the woman that was teaching the class explained how drug testing for DOT, because you're certified under DOT, Department of Transportation, how that came into play. And I want to tell you that story because it gripped me. We all look at, I believe, I could be wrong, maybe I'm wrong, I hope not to judge, but this is what I see as I worked with employers for the last 10 years. In general, we all view drug testing as the necessary evil and we hate it, and if we can get away with not doing it, we won't. And the employees hate it, nobody's happy to do it, and it's a big pain, And so we kind of, could take it or leave it, and if we cut our budgets, it's the first thing to go. That's sort of how it goes down. So Diane Bowski, who's since passed away from lung cancer, little short, sassy lady, told this story. And I repeat this to absolutely every person that I have trained to become certified drug collections professional since. And I became a corporate trainer for franchises in that organization. And so I've been a trainer now for the bulk of the 10 years. But this is the story. 1987, for those of you who remember that year, probably me and everybody older than me definitely remembers. There was a commuter train January morning after Christmas break heading away from Washington, D.C., where people had flown in from their holiday travels, or gone to visit family or whatever have you. And everybody was headed home to start the school year, the work week. Train had hundreds of people on it. And the train was clipping along, doing what it was supposed to do. It was an Amtrak train. Crossed the state line into Maryland. And all of a sudden, there was a Conrail engine sitting crossways on the track, and they couldn't stop, and it crashed. And I will never forget that morning. As a young woman, I was 20, turning on the news, and you got to remember, I mean, this is before 24 streaming news and 500 channels. We still had, maybe 10 at that time. We thought we were pretty hot stuff. Every channel had this crash with rail cars littering the place and bodies. And it was terrifying. And it was freezing cold, and they worked into the night to rescue people. 16 people lost their lives, including the engineer. What happened to that other train? What happened there? That train was also clipping along at a high rate of speed. But the engineer, Ricky Gates, and his brakeman, who was with him in the train, and signalman, signal/brakeman, they decided to share a joint in the engine as they were navigating. And the signalman missed all of the signs that said that there was an approaching train and they needed to switch tracks. And when they finally realized that something was wrong and they needed to stop, and they came to the stop, it was too late. They couldn't move, the other train couldn't avoid them. And guess what? The signalman got a broken leg and Ricky survived, of course. And Ricky went to prison for that. The accident was entirely blamed on the marijuana impairment that caused them to not give a crap. And when Ricky got out of prison years later, he did a lot of work in prevention to say this was my responsibility and I used marijuana on the job, and etc. 1987. I'm going to show you a lot of statistics today about the impact of marijuana on the brain and on people. And you have to understand that all of those studies were done about that era of Ricky Gates or up through the 90s. None of them have been conducted on today's weed, which I'm going to explain to you a bit. But as a result of the Chase Conrail's Maryland incident, it's now called, used to be called the tragedy, we're softening the language. President Ronald Reagan stepped in and mandated drug testing be implemented for all U.S. Department of Transportation safety-sensitive employees immediately by an act of Congress. And that's how we came to have 49 CFR Part 40, for those of you who know DOT, that mandates DOT drug testing. And when Diane told that story, she stood there and she said, "You think you're here to learn how to collect someone's pee, but you are here to save lives." And then she proceeded to read the names of the 16 victims. And it changed me, and I was no longer too good, to do this, and I really understood how vitally important this is. So that's where I'm coming from. I want you to know that and understand it. So we're going to talk about what's trending in the world of drug testing, safe workplaces versus an employee's right to use drugs. That is the era that we are in. That's the battleground, and it is a battleground. Drug testing and marijuana specifically, because so much is misunderstood about this. Before I do some myth busting, how many of you have heard that you can smoke pot one time and 30 days later test positive for a marijuana test? Raise your hand. Okay, we're going to bust that myth. All right, and then the policy options, as I mentioned. So I'm going to skip this right now because so much is changing so rapidly. Policy updates. I guess one thing that I want to say about this is NORML came out with a press release. If you don't know NORML, National Organization to Reform Marijuana Laws, and they have been working since the 1960s to legalize marijuana. It's their primary objective. And so there's a few subsidiaries, Drug Policy Alliance, Marijuana Policy Project, and a few others, the Cannabis Council, High Times Magazine is kind of one of their children. And so they almost passed it in the late 70s, early 80s. And then according to them and the guys that have, Peter Strzok and the guys that kind of all started this thing, they did a lot of interviews when Colorado passed Amendment 64 in 2012, kind of outlining their struggles with getting legalization. And they said that they would have been successful in 1980 had it not been for a group of hysterical mothers that were worried about their children getting high that came and marched on Washington and changed everything. And the only reason they succeeded is because they were led by Carol Burnett. And it had star power behind it. And then, of course, if you don't know this, that actually became the Just Say No campaign from Nancy Reagan. And so they decry Just Say No and say that it was an extreme failure and aided the war on drugs. But you need to know something. Drug use dropped, and it dropped for 20 years because of Just Say No. We know that we had impact. We know that prevention was successful. But they say, the war on drugs caused victims, which your law clearly states, and it's kind of a preposterous notion, but that's where we are today. So what is NORML doing? So now they're getting legalization, and this isn't a commentary on legalization, but I want you to really understand about workplace drug testing is that they cannot succeed with the environment that they want to create. This isn't about tax and regulate. This is about normalization and high use because it's about profit. So they cannot succeed in the manner in which they choose if workplace drug testing continues. So there are efforts ongoing since I served on Governor Hickenlooper's task force to implement the regulations in Colorado representing employers' rights to test. On day one, I introduced myself as Joe McGuire from the Drug and Alcohol Testing Industry Association, representing employers' rights to safe and drug-free workplace, and Kimberly Ryan, the attorney for the Cannabis Council, sitting directly across from me on public record in a public meeting with the state's attorney general, heading the table, said, "You can keep your mouth shut for the next 365 days. You're irrelevant and you have nothing to add here." Nobody else got that warm welcome. And I thought, what in the world? Well, I proceeded to find out that their intent is to make drug testing for marijuana illegal. And this press release, why it is important, is because on February 14th, 2017, 4 years later, almost to the day, NORML issued a press release saying that they are forming a multi-state workplace drug testing coalition that will, that's goal is to eliminate the outdated, antiquated, unfair, discriminatory practice of drug testing for marijuana in every state where marijuana is legal. And they proceeded to introduce bills in 3 states that didn't pass, but they'll keep coming back and coming back. But we are seeing now in states new to legalization that they implement, bans on pre-employment drug testing, which you have something sort of kind of similar. There's some states who are doing that altogether. New York City just banned all pre-employment drug testing unless you have safety-sensitive employees. Washington, D.C. is considering copying that language. And then I want to tell you one brief thing about this because I really want you to understand what's at jeopardy. And I get really passionate about this, but you'll understand why. There are several pieces of federal legislation that have been introduced to make marijuana legal in some form, not necessarily legal, but unlawful at the federal level for particular reasons. One is the Safe Banking Act, so people in the marijuana business can bank, which they do already bank. They just do it under DBAs and all these other things, but it doesn't matter. They want safe banking. But they have to make marijuana unlawful to do that because of money laundering laws and et cetera, et cetera. There's another one to decriminalize, to let people who are in jail over marijuana offenses out of prison because that's not fair, and so they have to make marijuana unlawful to go back and retroactively release them. There's another one called the States Act that makes any state that has legalized allow to have marijuana federally unlawful in their states as long as they, follow the rules and the feds won't bother them, and that would be a federal statute. Any of those laws that go into effect, or any others of the same nature, that makes marijuana unlawful, not even removed from the scheduling, unlawful, causes a chain reaction of HHS, Health and Human Services, to not be able to test for marijuana any longer because their rules say, it's actually not rules, it's laws, say they may only test for drugs that are unlawful. And HHS has already said if marijuana becomes lawful, we have to remove it from our testing panel by federal law. If HHS removes it from the testing panel, they no longer oversee all of the labs in the US that they license and certify to do drug testing, who are the labs that are approved for DOT. But in addition to that, so if you use Quest, if you use Alere, if you Abbott, if you use LabCorp, if you use any of those, this is for you, okay? So if HHS has to remove it from the drug test panel, guess what? DOT is forced by presidential order of Ronald Reagan, 1981, to only test for the drugs of abuse that HHS approves. So if HHS has to pull THC, DOT has to pull THC from the test panel. We have verified this with DOT, we have verified this with HHS, we have verified this with the Office of Drug and Alcohol Policy Compliance, who have all helped us lobby in DC for a safety carve-out. And at first we were told we were lying and all these other things, but once it got verified, then some of the people started going, oh, well, that would be bad. And yet there are others who are saying to us, well, we shouldn't test for THC, so you need to go away. That is happening. But aside from that, if any of these bills fail and another one passes and we don't have a safety carve-out, that's going to take place. We have been told that nobody thinks anybody will sponsor a standalone legislation for a safety carve-out right now. And then the second problem is that if we right now, the way that they're working it is the safety carve-out will be DOT. And my organization has been pushing for non-DOT safety sensitive to be included. Oil and gas isn't DOT, mining isn't DOT. Manufacturing isn't DOT, right? And you raised your hands. We have non-DOT, safety sensitive. So we're trying to get a broader carve out. We don't know if we can. Right now there's so many things up in the air, but Banking Act is being pushed hard. And if Banking Act goes and this does not happen, we could see where we cannot test pilots, school bus drivers, truck drivers, railroad engineers, pipeline, hazardous gas, nuclear, Coast Guard. That's in jeopardy. And it's hard for us to wrap our minds around it, but I have sat in the office of DOT in the last 6 weeks and they have said that is what we will have to do by federal law. And they're scared to death, but They don't have a lot of power in Congress to do anything. They have to react to Congress. So this is really interesting times we're in. So when I have this slide up here saying that they are impacting workplace drug testing laws and our perspectives and driving the conversation, it's important, it matters. Because your perspectives have changed on this because of what's in the media on this, and you probably don't even realize it. So this is one of the reasons I start with this presentation, is because I want you to understand the value of it. So you can find all these stories on the internet of how it's a failure, it doesn't work, it's unproven, it should be banned, it's discrimination. This is all completely generated by the organizations I previously mentioned. It's a huge campaign, it's a decades-long campaign. You can find thousands and thousands of articles. You can look at their online resource libraries and just look at these subjects all day long, and they're all written by themselves. You know, they've got a team of people for years, and they just crank them out and crank them out and crank them out while the rest of us go to work. And so, you know, we didn't see this coming and haven't combated it well and are way behind the curve, but here we are. And I'm one person explaining this to groups like you, but I can't compete with that. So it's kind of frustrating. So let's start with square one. Why is marijuana still Schedule I? Because it meets absolutely all the criteria for remaining Schedule I that you can see bulleted. President Obama, in his first term in office, second year, asked for a review by the Department of Justice of whether or not cannabis, THC, marijuana, whatever, could be descheduled or rescheduled. They did a 6-year study with 6 governmental organizations, including the National Institutes of Health, several universities, I can name them all, but at the end of 6 years, the report came back. I have a copy of the report if you want it, with all of the science that shows that it still continues to meet all of the criteria and more, and must remain Schedule I. And so this was 18 months before he left office. He could have, with the stroke of a pen, the only way that we know of that you can override the scheduling, the scientific, rigorous process for scheduling, is by presidential order. So many thought he would go ahead and just do that. He did not. I was really surprised. But there are many, many, many bills every year to get it descheduled or rescheduled. But it still meets the criteria. And the one thing you need to really, really, really hear me on with marijuana that's very, very confusing is the plant is highly unstable in its natural form. So you can have 10 seeds from the same mother plant, which we don't grow from seeds anymore. We clone them, but it doesn't matter. You can plant 10 plants from the same clone or mother plant, and those 10 plants will have 10 varieties of THC. You can clone 10 plants from a mother plant and have 10 levels, I should say, of THC. You can take one of those samples and let's dry them, let's roll them, and 10 of us can smoke a joint, and 10 of us could have different reactions. We don't actually know how many different reactions there are. It's not like there are 3 and we can narrow that down. Some people are mildly affected, some say they don't feel affected at all, some are extremely affected, some get violently ill, some have psychotic breaks, not on low-grade weed, but on today's weed, if they have underlying mental conditions, if they have other medications that are contraindicators. We don't know any of those reasons, okay? So because of the instability of it, doctors cannot come up with a diagnosing mechanism. It's been tried. It just is so varied that it's been hard to narrow down. And synthesizing it into Marinol, what we thought was a solution. Here we are, we have a solution, this is going to work. When we legalized medical marijuana in Colorado in 2001, I voted for it because I have family members who've died of cancer, I have family members who have died of AIDS, and I was a compassionate woman, and I said, if people need that for end of life, it's not me, I'm not, I'll never use it, never have, but I'm in. When I saw what happened with this, I thought it was going to be Marinol, and then like old people smoking joints with a plant somewhere. That is not, and you've seen it. I was like, what is this? I did not know this was medical marijuana. What the heck? Candies and all these things. And I was really surprised by that. Because marijuana is Schedule 1, physicians in the United States of America are not allowed to prescribe it. There's no such thing as a legal prescription for marijuana anywhere in the United States, even in legal marijuana states. So when you hear I have a marijuana prescription, no they don't. They have a card that says it's legal here for me to carry, possess, purchase, that kind of thing. I used to call it a get out of jail free card, but that was way back before recreational marijuana. So that's all that is. It's permission. In our state now, a medical marijuana card only gets you a cheaper tax rate. That's it. So it's just a permission card. And the doctor who chooses to participate will say, if you want to try it, you can try it. Here you go. You're allowed to have it in the state of Illinois. But you take your card and you go to a shop where the dude from Colorado, and I've met them, and they proudly say, oh, I got lucky, I hired a guy from Colorado. But the dude is the one who tells you what to try and how much and when and how, and if that doesn't work, come back and try this, and if that doesn't work, come back and try this, and we'll titrate you up, you know, till you feel good about it or you can't tolerate it or whatever. So it's not medically overseen because of this. Is that good or bad? Well, I think it's bad, and how could it change? Change by rescheduling. So we're in this vicious cycle, but doctors right now don't have that science. They would like to have that science, I think, but right now we don't. So we don't have dosing standards and all that stuff. So I just want you to know that because of all of these things, legal marijuana or not, medical marijuana card or not in the workplace, it is not HIPAA compliant. Anything Schedule 1 is not HIPAA. So I get all the time, I get calls from HR people, well, they're standing here in front of me with this medical marijuana card, now what do I do? Am I violating his privacy by looking at? No, all he did was just admit to you that he smokes weed or whatever form he uses it in now. No. So your policy still stands. That has no impact on can or cannot, although now in Illinois you cannot discriminate. So you cannot ever, and I've never recommended this anyway, but you cannot just say, you have a medical marijuana card, you're fired, because that would be discrimination. So what you're getting is awareness, knowledge, but there's no valid HIPAA protections or anything like that at this point, which that could change. Okay, so myths about testing. All right, so safe, harmless like a glass of wine. Not anything like a glass of wine at all. You can drink a glass of wine at dinner and not get drunk. I think pretty much everybody can. You cannot smoke a joint and not get high. You cannot eat an edible and not get high. It's not just a little buzz for a minute and you're cool. This is a high. So it's not the same thing, and you don't know what that outcome could be, so it's really not. And it behaves differently, and it stays in the body differently, and all of those other things, as you all know. The reason that they are able to say that marijuana is safer than alcohol for many, many years, that will change one of these days. But at this point in time, the reason this can be said is because at the time that this all began, the World Health Organization was the organization that kept all the statistics on alcohol-related deaths, incidents, diseases, etc., mortalities in general. And they've done that for decades. We're closing in on 100 years of data. But they have never tracked illicit drugs. They tracked alcohol. So the marijuana industry, and I know this because, remember guys, I was on this council with these folks for a year, and I would ask questions, and they would, you know, my nature and personality is, Joe is a super nice person, and so they were always trying to recruit me and get me to their side, because they were like, you could be a great spokesperson, you could really help us with compliance. If you just understand how this works, I mean, you could help write these regs and rules because you really understand this. So I learned a lot. So what they would say is, look, you can go to the World Health Organization website and there are no statistics on marijuana. There's no dangers, there's no risks, there's no nothing. You know what? No data doesn't mean safe. It's just never been tracked. So, according to World Health Organization, any death related to alcohol is an alcohol-related death.
Good.
Why do I say that? DUI. Someone kills a victim in a drunk driving accident, that is an alcohol-related death. Wait, why aren't we tracking those for marijuana impairment? Because I know people who have died in fiery crashes and we're still saying no deaths related to marijuana. Guys, it's not just overdose. Let me ask you a question. How many of you know someone that has died because of a tobacco-related illness? Raise your hand. Oh, you have. Did they overdose on those cigarettes? Did they smoke so many cigarettes one day that they died of that cigarette smoking? No, was it lung cancer? Was it, was some kind of cancer, right? You can't overdose on tobacco, and yet we know it's highly deadly, but why are we saying marijuana is safe? We know it has 27 more carcinogens in the raw leaf than tobacco. Is smoking of any kind healthy? Smoking is not, taking anything in your body carcinogenically is not healthy. It's damaging your lungs, and yet we're saying totally safe. Safe, safe, safe. Saw more of it yesterday at the presentation with Dr. Weiner. Had a ad for some medical marijuana on a website that says completely safe and harmless. And it's just absolutely not true. So you may not be able to sit in one sitting and overdose, but that doesn't make it safe. And by the way, the overdose story is changing, but this was back in the day. So anyway, if I use marijuana one time, it will show up in test 30 days later. This is absolutely patently false and is a lie that has been spread so deeply it's ingrained into the fabric of our society, and it's very difficult to overturn. So it's just categorically untrue. So I smoked weed one time. This is what happens. It depends on what I use and how much. So if it's a puff, puff, pass in a group situation, which is common, or if I just decide I'm gonna have a whole joint. Guys, I'm gonna go all in. I'm just gonna do the whole thing. All right, either way, it goes in my body and it goes through the process and it does settle in my fat. However, I will fail a drug test likely, okay, if I've shared the joint, probably not even gonna fail the test unless it's just right about a 12 to 24 hour window, and then that's it. Because it was a little bit. But if I smoked the whole thing or ate the whole cookie or whatever, I've got about 36 to 48 hours, and then I'm gonna pass the drug test. And you're not gonna get it right away. If you found out that, your kid, you caught him in the basement smoking on Sunday night and you marched him in the drug test facility on Monday morning, it's not going to show up because it's not metabolized through the urine yet. It takes about 24 hours. Wait till Tuesday. It's my parent insider information. So you wait till Tuesday if you really believe it's the first time. I had a little 12-year-old one time. It was truly the first time he'd really smoked, and he was crying, and his mother drug him in literally by the ear. And he passed the drug screen, and she was furious. And she wanted to send him to rehab, and I'm like, he's 12. I really think this was the first time. It's not good, it's not okay, but you caught it. Go from there, But, so I smoked the whole thing. I have a window. And there's two things about the drug test. There's point-of-care testing, rapid testing, as we call it. Some of you call it quick test, dip test, whatever. It's the instant test. Most of those are zero tolerance tests. You can do a dip test and probably anything will show up. Secondhand exposure will show up, whatever will show up. If you are making any employment decision on a rapid test, shame on you. You're gonna get in trouble, you're gonna get sued, and you're gonna lose. You do not ever make an employment decision on a rapid test. You send it to the lab. Rapid tests are only for screening purposes, presumptive positives they're called, or sometimes people refer to them as a non-negative because it's not negative and it's not positive. Those go to the lab. So I'm not talking about a rapid test. I am talking lab-based for that reason, okay? So I smoke, 36 hours later, my sample goes to the lab, the whole joint goes to the lab. There's cutoff levels, as you should well know. There's screening and confirmation cutoff levels. There is no flipping way that one joint 3 days ago is going to come out over the cutoff level. So I want you to hear me on this, much less 30 days later, right? By 5 days, it is out of your system, gone. It's out of your system. One joint. So here's where the lie comes from. Drug screening is designed to capture chronic, consistent use. That's what it's for. It's for the chronic drug user. And I mean hair testing and fingernail testing, and all of it is the chronic user. The only single test that is now capturing one-time use is a lab-based oral fluid test. And that's a whole different story, and I will talk about that in a little bit, but lab-based oral fluid can now capture a 24-hour window of marijuana use, and it doesn't capture the before, it captures the right then. So you get an idea of what's happening like in the last 24 hours. That's the only one. But we haven't used oral fluid. We've used urinalysis and hair. Hair is history, not right now. Urine is the story. Urine tells you the story of what this person does habitually. And so the person who has been a chronic user, we used to say the person who used weekly, they're using so much. Now they're using 6 to 20 times a day, and that is no joke. So the person who's using chronically, I had a guy call me several months ago. I was working for an Alaska-based company for a friend of mine for the last few years before I started working for the organization I founded. And so in Alaska, there's a lot of pipeline and Coast Guard testing, obviously, as you can imagine. So I'm in Juneau, and a guy calls me, and he goes, Joe, I need your help. He says, I've been out of work for a couple of years, and I've been trying to get this job at mining, and I put in for it like years ago, and it takes years to get hired at the mines, but they start at 6 figures. They are very, very beneficial jobs to have. And he goes, they called me up, and I've been smoking weed, and I need to pass this drug test. It's everything to me. Can I come in, and would you do a drug test on me to tell me if it's going to show up or not? And he goes, if I could see how long it's going to take me to get out of my system, then I know how long to stall coming in for the interview. And he's been smoking every day, and so it took him 6 weeks. Tested him every day for 6 weeks, and he blew him off, and he blew him off, and he blew him off, and he blew him off. Because the mine tests lab-based oral fluid, hair, and urine pre-employment screening, and he knew that. So 6 weeks. That's the guy. For 30 days later. That's the guy. Okay? And back when pot was low-grade THC, it was 30 days. Now, with the products that we have, we are seeing 60 and 90 days. 60 and 90 days. Some people are telling me longer. The problem with the thing of longer, I was actually writing a paper for a physician a few weeks ago, and I said in the paper, some say longer. And this paper is going to be in like a medical journal of some kind. And so he's critiquing me like, physicians are going to read this. Cite that, cite that, cite that, source that, source that, source that. She did pretty good. In a 20-page paper, I had 36 citations. I thought that was awesome. Now apparently I need 50. So I, no problem, have this one, have this. So I'm clicking through, and I say, some say more, cite that. And I was like, oh. So I start calling all of the guys at the labs and the MROs and everybody, and I'm like, can you tell me, can you verify, can I get a quote? Because we talk about it all the time in our industry. Every one of them said, here's the problem with you quoting me on that and us officially saying it. How do we know that that guy's not lying? You know what? That's what it comes down to. It comes down to the word of the individual. Are they telling the truth, or are they just titrating down until they have a clean test? We don't know. So we cannot scientifically say, unless we put him in a lab and didn't let him out for 160 days, that is the case. We just have no way of knowing. So I had to go back to 30, 60, or 90. So, so there you have it. So here's the summary. John, your drug test says you are consuming THC. That was one time 30 days ago, and it's legal here, and you can't do that to me. And I'm not impaired because it was 30 days ago, and I'm going to sue you. What is John doing? He's lying. He's lying. One time 30 days ago is the equivalent to, it wasn't mine, it was my friend's. He just put it in my pocket, right? Which went out in junior high. That's the junior high equivalent. One time 30 days ago. It is a lie. You have to remember that. If you want scientific statements and quotes and white papers on that, I will send them to you. I have them. It's a lie. So now that we have a baseline, we can go on. All right? So all of that stuff is myth around drug testing. Okay, it's easy to cheat a drug test. Present system and testing isn't fair. That's what we have. Everything is presence and system testing, even alcohol, believe it or not. Alcohol impairment testing is not based on impairment. We have somewhat close-ish, but there's still variables. We just changed the law because of death. It's only easy to cheat a test if you have a collector who doesn't know what they're doing and doesn't care. If you test, you won't have any employees left. Not fair. You might, or not true. You might have some challenges, but we can work around those. People who use daily are not impaired because they build up a tolerance. So do people who use alcohol every day. It's called functional alcoholic. Do we let those go by? Same thing. Same thing. All right. You can't test for marijuana in recreational legal states. Yes, you can. Okay, so what's happening on the employment scene? Rocky Mountain Employment Council surveys employers in Denver frequently to ask them what they're doing in tests, and this keeps changing. Every 2 years they do this survey, and every 2 years more employers are dropping THC from the drug test, dropping their drug testing policies altogether. Initially, something like 84% of them tightened their rules and restrictions. And then I think right now it's about 48% of those people have said, we just can't keep people. The problem with those people who are saying we just can't keep people, they don't know how to write and enforce a policy. They should go through this class. We could work on that. But it can be helped, and they don't need to resort to just giving in to this. So I'm just going to run through some real quick stats on the impact of substance abuse in the workplace in general. 5 times more likely to file a workers' compensation claim. 35% of industrial injuries that take place in the U.S. involve drug or alcohol. Substance abusers are 33% less productive on the job. Absenteeism is significantly higher. These are U.S. Department of Labor, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, et cetera. OSHA as well. Substance abusers file a higher number of medical claims. Operating machinery, clearly at risk. Substance abusers are responsible for 40% of all industrial fatalities. Read that one again. Substance abuse costs small businesses approximately $7,000 a month in lost revenue. There are estimates that say it's as high as 12. It depends on the level of problems that you have. Okay? Employee marijuana use. This comes from a longitudinal study. There's a lot of people out there that try to debunk this. This study has been proven over and over again. I've read recent studies that confirm it again and repeated it. I've read studies that have tried to debunk it and found it to be entirely accurate. Employees who use marijuana have 55% more industrial accidents, 85% more injuries, 75% more absenteeism. They also are less motivated. It affects their commitment. Following nearly 2,000 people for 25 years, folks. Regular marijuana users were less committed, had a level of commitment that grew worse over time, and their commitment improved when marijuana use ceased. Okay? Right now there's over 3/4 of the workforce in the United States are in states where marijuana is legal in some form. So it's a real issue. We can't ignore it. It's there. This is what I hear the most from employers. I don't care what they do Friday night on their own time. None of my business as long as they come to work Monday morning ready to work. Friday night use went out with the 80s. We are now into Monday through Sunday use. But if that's your argument, I just want you to see that the days of old school weed are gone. The product on the far right is called a dab or wax concentrate, BHO, butane hash oil extraction, whatever. It's also called earwax butter. There's a lot of names. How many of you know what you are looking at? Raise your hand. 2 of you, the cops and the military. Okay, this is the number 2 product in Colorado behind edibles right now, although it's breaking neck speed for number 1. When this product materialized, now when we legalized in 2012, the industry really poo-pooed the notion that THC was going to go over 20%. In Woodstock, I'm sure you've heard this, but it bears repeating, Woodstock days, THC content was 1 to 3%. Maui Wowie was 3%. That was the good stuff. By the way, I present to a lot of construction workers, so if I ever let a swear word slip, I am really sorry. It goes through my mind, and then I hold myself back, so I apologize. It might come out. It's not like a way of life, but it happens. So they said, our mayor was on the radio saying, folks, right now, our cops are seizing on the street raw marijuana at 12 and 15%, and then the industry would get on to counteract and say, he's just a doom and gloom, sky is falling prohibitionist, it can't get over 20%. So I go and look up the research, and the research says you can't grow weed in its natural state over about 21 to 24%, because as I told you, the plant is highly unstable and it breaks down itself. So there's been studies all over the world where there's been huge warehouses grown for the purpose of studying this. It's not like we've never had studies, they're out there. And so I thought, okay, well, that seems true. So we passed the law, and then the next thing we know, here are dab lab explosions, and everybody's like, what is a dab? And it was happening so frequently, they're basically like meth lab explosions, that the Colorado Department of Public Health had an emergency meeting for all the people to come and learn about what this is. So I go to the meeting. Remember the agency I just said to you, Colorado Department of Public Health. That sounds pretty official. So here we are in this meeting, and the speaker was John the Bud Tender, and then another dude that called himself like Danger or something, I don't remember. And with all these, like doctors and police officers and everybody. The cops knew, but the doctors had no idea. There's treatment providers and people like me in drug testing and public health and stuff. So he gets up there and he goes, so we have to have these products because 1 hit of dabs is equal to about 26, 27 hits of a joint. Super potent, they're super powerful extractions, and I know for me, it saves me time. Instead of smoking 1 joint right after the other, after the other, after the other, I can dab like 4 times a day, and it's just a time saver. Now, these potencies at that time started at 30%. So what they do, I'm not going to go in the whole process, you can look it up on YouTube if you really want to know, but they basically take the plant that's been genetically modified and has a lot of the waxy trichomes on the top that looks like dew, that look like little honey, that's the THC. They take that and they superheat it, and then they use like butane or propane, a substance like that, to superheat it, to condense it, to squeeze it out and get pure THC extract. So it has to be heated to over a certain degree and then extracted with a chemical, and then it cools. And then however pure it is, or the amount of cooling, or how high the heat was, depends on the viscosity. So it can look like that, it can look clear like honey, it can look like butter, like orange butter, exactly like earwax. And that's the concentrate. They started at 30% THC and everybody freaked out. Now that's nothing. You go and look anywhere, 90%, 95%, 100% THC. We're talking THC levels that we have never seen before in the history of man. They did not do that 10,000 years ago. And guess what? That in your law is defined as marijuana. Is that marijuana? You talk to a recovering drug addict and they'll tell you that is the same process you use to cook heroin or crack. You use chemicals, you use heat, you melt it down, you extract it, you get the pure form of it. That's what that is. So a lot of people call it green crack, but then there's also a strain of marijuana called green crack, so it's very confusing. But it's so potent that you can only use a teeny tiny bit. So you see the white of my fingernail, about half of that is one serving. And if you are marijuana naive, and I know this from all the public service announcement campaigns that state of Colorado runs, in addition to my education by Danger and Bud Tender. And I'm sorry I sound so facetious, but to me this stuff is ridiculous, so I apologize, but there it is. So you take this little amount and you have to, back in the day, you had to superheat it in a rig and there had to be some boiling water and stuff, and then you would inhale it. If you're marijuana naive, you cannot use this first time. You will pass out, be rendered unconscious, and require CPR, resuscitation. People have ended up on life support for days at a time, but it's totally harmless and safe. Children have gotten exposed to this and been unconscious for 11 days in the hospital on breathing machines. But when I asked the industry if they were going to take responsibility for that, they said the child is home and doing fine. There was nothing wrong. And I always say, I'm kind of bleeding into one of my other presentations, but I always say, what would I have to do to a child to render them unconscious in the hospital for that many days on life support and it'd be fine? But anyway, so marijuana naive cannot use this. You have to build up to it. You have to have a good tolerance for it, and then you can start. And so our public service announcement campaigns, and yours too, will say, start low, go slow, so that you educate the public. You don't start with this. You have to start with a little bit and then build up, and then you get your tolerance up, and then you can use a whole bunch. One of the major problems with this product right now, not only is it high potency, not only is it extremely dangerous, not only is it popular, not only is it cheap, but they have now manufactured the e-cigarettes, the vape pens, to have the high enough heat tolerance to take these on, and you can vape them. Have I said anything inaccurate?
No.
Thank you.
I think it would be important to add that the weight, the legal point, the weight, this is the way to go because you can get so much more bang for your buck.
Right.
Instead of buying the big thing and gone, buy the little one, you can see for criminal purposes. The higher weight, if you have brownies, you're getting in charge of all the weight of brownies versus this, you're getting in charge of that. That's going to be, right now, that's a little hangout.
It's going to be your number one. So if you couldn't hear him, this is the way to go. This is how you get the most bang for your buck by weight, because you guys put weight limits on purchases. By the way, did you do anything about going shop to shop to shop to shop to get those weights? Does your law do anything about going from shop to shop to shop to shop to get those weights? Yeah. So there's a way around it. But gosh, I shouldn't be telling you guys that, like you. That should be a private conversation, so don't break the law. So these things are huge. So I used to show everybody this and say, these go in the vape pens, but now the dabs go in the vape pens. These are nothing. And these are anywhere from 10 to 100 servings per cartridge that drop in the vape pen. There's indica, sativa, and a hybrid blend. How many of you know the difference between indica and sativa? Again, my two guys. Oh, Jordan, you're cheating. You can't raise your hand. Okay, the strain of marijuana referred to as indica chills you out, calms you down. They say you use indica, you're indicouch, because that's your stoner, okay? Sativa, on the other hand, amps you up, gets your heart racing, higher risk of heart attack immediately after use, right? Read High Times magazine. If you're in the prevention industry, you should have a subscription and you should read it from cover to cover so you know what's going on. There's articles in there all the time. Man, these high potent stats are so awesome, I was able to quit cocaine, which they love because cocaine's expensive. So you can replace cocaine with sativa. And so you hear people say, well, this guy got on a plane in Seattle after eating a marijuana brownie. He was from back east, it wasn't legal yet. And after 20 minutes in the air, he went in the bathroom, ripped the whole bathroom apart. They had to force land in San Francisco, and he got arrested. Remember that story? And only thing in his system, 250 drug panel, THC. So there's 200 comments under the story. That was not pot. He was on something else. That's bull. They're lying. There was something else. Pot doesn't do that. Sativa does that. High potent sativa, absolutely, 100% does that. And that's the strain that causes underlying mental health conditions to come out and people to have their psychotic breaks, early presentation or whatever happens, it's the sativa. So when you see sativa, that's what we are talking about. And then people try to mix them with the hybrid to sort of balance them out or whatever, because you're always experimenting with your drugs. So one of these is a vape pen specifically for dabs and marijuana and THC. The other one is just a regular old vape pen for nicotine. Which one is which? These are the cartridges that go in, the THC cartridges. Which one is which? The other one is nicotine. You point them out? Now this one will kind of give it away. These are the flavor oils that you put in. You put flavor drops or scent drops in. Well, the vaping scent is very mass. You can't always smell the THC anyway, but then it makes it taste good because this stuff tastes like garbage. So it makes it taste nice. So you get strawberry, banana, orange, mango, marshmallow. But over here on this side, you get Dark Side of the Moon, Yellow Brick Road. I don't know what flavor that is, but now you kind of get it, right? So here you are. How I found out about these things is the intake coordinator at a nursing school called me, and she goes, I need your help. My nursing students are going out on the Lanai to vape, which is a tobacco-free campus, but they can vape on the porch. They're coming back in, and I swear half of them are stoned. This is weird. Do you know anything that can be happening with a vape pen that would cause that? And I'm like, I've never heard of that, but I know a guy who works up at the American Lung Association. I'll call him and see if he's heard of anything, because he's always on me that I need to talk about vaping, and I'm like, yeah, whatever. I don't have time for that. I'm talking about pot. So I call him up, and he goes, oh, I'm sending you an email right now. Are you in front of your email? I go, yeah. He goes, check your email. I open it up, and it was those 3 cartridges. And I go, what is that? Oh my God. And he goes, yeah, you could drop those suckers right in a traditional. This was before the high heat and all of that. And he goes, yeah, they're totally doing pot. So now we are seeing banning of vaping on campuses. College campuses, high school campuses, work campuses, USAA campus in Colorado Springs, complete ban on vaping on site. You don't know what's in them, you can't smell them, you don't know what people are using, and you're going to have to be hyper aware of the signs and symptoms. So what's happening, this I think is pretty significant. And so Quest Diagnostics Drug Testing Index shows the greatest increase in use of all illicit drugs by U.S. employees in the last 12 years based on lab drug test results. And this is since 2013, which was the first year of legalization in Colorado. That's when the trend went from this to this. And that's not an exaggerated line. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, drug and alcohol-related deaths in the workforce soared in 2016 with a spike of more than 30% in a single year. The BLS also shows that fatal work injuries in 2016 were the highest since 2008. So for any of you who may be safety managers or work with your safety managers, and you're doing all these safety meetings, and you're doing safety toolbox kits, and you're trying to keep that mod rate down, and you're looking at those OSHA statistics, if you're not addressing drug and alcohol use in the workplace, you are missing the boat and wasting your time. And I don't mean once, and I don't mean annually, I mean consistently. You've got to talk about drug and alcohol use and the impact, or you are not helping your numbers. We've got, yes, it is a problem, hiring people for sure who can pass the drug test. 12 applicants, the drug tester walks in, 9 walk out, 2 pass the screen, 1 fails for THC. Jim Johnson of GE Johnson Construction in Denver says if I get a federal project, federal dollars, where I have to drug test my employees to complete the project, I have to hire from outside of state to find the qualified applicants. Pate Construction in Southern Colorado says for every 75 people we interview, we can find about 15 who can pass the test. Notice, do I have a pointer? Okay, always worried I'm going to shut it off. This is not 75 applicants. This is 75 people we interview. How much money is that? You know how long it takes before you get to the interview? Every one of you know. Well, I was hiring for my friend in Alaska for the last 6 years, and in Juneau, people don't keep jobs because they always go to the seasonal and work on the cruise ships and all that stuff, so they quit every 9 months. That was a lot of money. That's a lot of money. Here's a problem. It took 2 months to find 3 CDL drivers that could pass the drug test. Salaries were competitive. What's wrong with that statement? CDL, DOT, zero tolerance. They have zero tolerance and everybody knows it. That's a problem. Leona Wilner, who owns an employment placement staffing agency in Colorado Springs, says more than half the applicants who came to her company looking for work failed because 1 in 3 attempted to cheat the test. That number is way higher now. My friend Chuck, who did the electric company drug testing, says I catch anywhere between 2 to 5 bottles of these per day, and sometimes as many as 10 per day. If you don't have a drug tester who cares about the integrity of the test, you got a problem, and you need to make sure they are trained in how to detect a cheater. We're teaching classes on that now. Other challenges, employers are having employees, and this also applies to law enforcement, guys, and this is huge for our law enforcement. They are going in to grow operations for simple maintenance jobs, HVAC and lighting repair and plumbing and just normal stuff that you call a company to do, and they're going there to do it. Employees end up in the emergency room for the rest of the day. They lose that entire day of labor, and the longer they stay in, the longer they're in the emergency room because of the chemicals that they're exposed to. So I started getting these questions, and I started responding with hazmat suit 'em, and don't send them in unless they have hazmat suits. So I ran that by a cop friend that I know in Oakland, California, and he goes, Joe, we are not allowed anymore to go into a grow without a hazmat suit because we've got guys who are now having very serious diseases based on the chemicals they've been exposed to. And sadly, he is now one of those victims, but this is serious business. If you're an HVAC or any of those trades and you're just performing any of that maintenance, it's not someone in the grow industry, you need to be very careful. And it could be things that they say are completely legal and non-toxic, but just be careful, guys. You just really need to understand that. And then there's the chemicals exposure. And then there's the driving issue. So immediately after we pass this, employers start calling me from all over the country. I can't tell you how quickly I became known as the marijuana lady. Like, it happened overnight, and it was never what I intended ever. I was the drug prevention lady. I don't know how that came about, but people started calling me and saying, I did a couple webinars, and then it went from there. But okay, Joe, so we're in Houston, and we have a chain of our franchises in all throughout Colorado. And we're thinking about, that 15 nanogram cutoff level for THC in urine is pretty low. And we think since it's legal there, our employees should be allowed to have 100 nanograms in their system, and we want to have your professional opinion on that. And I said, well, I'm not a forensic toxicologist, nor am I a doctor, nor am I a scientist. Are you? And he said, no. Big old Houston accent. I said, I'm not trying to be disrespectful. It's an honest question. He goes, no. This is our board of directors. And I said, okay. And I said, well, here's the problem with that as I see it. I mean, this is before all of the potencies, okay? Like, this is before the law took effect. I said, the problem that I see with that at this point is you tell someone that they can have this much THC in their system and it's that far over the cutoff level, which is established by HHS and SAMHSA for decades. They're reviewed about every 10 years, and they're adjusted according to potencies and all this stuff. And we don't know what they mean. But I do know they rule out secondhand exposure. That's the primary purpose of the cutoff level, is this means personal use and anything else means it could be your roommates. That's what we're trying to go for. You used this, it wasn't your environment. That's the cutoff level. That's it. Right? So you change that. Now you can't rule out any of that, first of all. But the second thing is, so, okay, I said, I know your company, you have delivery drivers. And he goes, oh yeah, if you work for us, you have to do the cash and take the orders, and I'm not going to tell you the rest they do because you'll know who it is. It's 100% mandatory, you have to deliver the products. I said, wait, you mean like 100% of the employees drive? Yeah. Okay. So you've got an employee and you've said 100 nanograms is great. And he goes on a delivery. I realize I say he a lot, not only trying to pick on the men, I need to work on my genders, I apologize. So he's driving and he crashes and kills somebody, and you're in court. And you're sitting there because the family is suing the whole company, and you're trying to make sure the employee takes the heat, not you. And so he's on the stand and they say, sir, what in the world made you think that you could drive with 95 nanograms of THC in your system? And he says, well, because my employer said that was allowable and that was what I was allowed to do. And the whole room turns to you, and now you have to get on the stand and explain why that was okay. And he said, Joe, I will call you back. He never did. And I don't know what they did, but I do know that the city and county of Pueblo said that any city or county employee is allowed to have 100 nanograms of THC in their system. It happens. People do it because they think it sounds good and it sounds fair and they have no idea what it means. 1 in 5 marijuana users in the state also report driving after using marijuana. This is a crash of a friend of mine who nearly lost her legs and still has many problems walking, will be in a wheelchair at some point because of a guy who crashed into her car, marijuana use in Pueblo, Colorado, and he walked away scot-free, and she's left with her injuries for the rest of her life. Boundaries work. Keith Swerdfiger of Swerdfiger Construction lives in Pueblo. Pueblo has vowed to be the Napa Valley of marijuana. It is one of the most prolific marijuana cities in the state of Colorado. 2/3 of our counties opted out. Pueblo was one of the 13 that went all in whole hog. And he says, I have the largest construction company in this county. I kept my policies intact. I educate and notify everybody that we don't mess around here. If you want a job and you want good pay because we pay well, you don't come here and fail a drug test. And guess what? They don't bother to apply. They know better. And he said, I have a full workforce, I get all my jobs done on time, and I'm winning the contracts here. Reg Rudolph of the utilities company says something similar, except for he said, we weren't really enforcing our policy much when this all started, but we got together and we reviewed everything and we decided to send a strong message, and so far we have not had any problems. That was 2 years ago. I got those quotes from those guys. 7 years in, right? So they're doing it. It can work, but you've got to pick a path. Now, can you compromise? Yeah, we'll talk about some reasonable compromises today, but at some point you got to pick a path. You're going to be like the guys in Denver who just start canceling their policies. Drug test programs have proven success. There are so many articles that prove this over and over. According to National Survey of Drug Use and Health, workers who are not in a drug test program have substance abuse rates 50% higher than those who are in mandatory programs. U.S. Department of Transportation's model has worked successfully and significantly over the years. National Bureau of Economic Research says the military's policy has been extremely successful. You guys, you should see this data. If you ever want to look at these studies, email me. I will send you the data. This study on the military is so significant. The military drug testing program started after all the soldiers were coming home from Vietnam with cocaine. And the use rates from 1974 to 1981 just tanked. It was incredible what it did for the military. It is an absolute deterrent. If you hear it's not, you're just listening to people who for some reason are going to profit or want to use drugs. That is all that is. Okay, I've already explained the drug testing thing on marijuana, but one thing that I want to explain to you about the 5 nanograms of DUI standard in Colorado, because I just got this question last night in an email from a guy who said, I have a client, so he's in the friend is in drug testing, and he has a client who is demanding that Robert raise the nanogram cutoff level in his oral fluid test to 5 nanograms because instead of 1, because Colorado has a 5 nanogram limit for DUI. So this is how Colorado came up with the 5 nanogram limit, for those of you who don't know. So we're at the Governor's Council, and we're sitting around, and I and several of my colleagues in this industry, and toxicologists, I lit up the drug testing industry with this subject, and I said I need any piece of science that talks about impairment studies of any kind for driving sent to this task force work group, because they are deciding the standard. So they did, which that committee later said we didn't have time to read that stuff. But sitting around, and there are studies out of Europe, Germany in particular, New Zealand, Australia, France, multiple studies. You hear, we never studied this. The US may not have, but this has been studied. We're repeating that. So studies come out over and over and over again saying maintaining 1 nanogram of THC in the whole blood, active THC. And so whole blood, it passes through whole blood really fast, but what happens, it settles in the brain. Brain is fatty tissue. You know it goes to the brain, it settles there too, just like the fat. And so your brain is a big fat piece of fat. So there's THC all in there. If you maintain 1, makes that fathead thing a lot funnier, that, you know, Archie Bunker. Okay, if you maintain 1 nanogram of THC in your brain, you show signs of impairment in driving tests over and over and over and over for decades. Multi-divided attention tasks, distractedness, signage, slow response time. I have the data, the science. So, committee. I'm not on the committee, I'm observing the committee. And so one of the people on the committee says, yeah, I mean, you know, we keep hearing 1 nanogram because that will show up in the blood test, because roadside is a blood test, there's nothing else yet. But, you know, that 1 sounds an awful lot like none. People will be really mad. And so, yeah, that sounds, we can't say none. None is 0 tolerance. You can't say 0 tolerance. Because 0 tolerance makes you a prohibitionist. So we can't do that. So what do you think we should do? Silence. 1 guy. How about 5? Do 5? You think 5 sounds good? Do you think 5? You think, are we ready to vote? Who thinks 5 sounds good? Majority? 5. 5 it is. 5's our law. That is how we got that law. And if you don't believe me, go to the AAA study that every time they show the increase of crashes, fatalities due to marijuana in the state of Colorado, they say the 5 nanogram standard is baseless. The 5 nanogram standard is based on nothing. The 5 nanogram standard has no whatsoever backing. And that's our law, and it's contestable. So we have people 5 and 10 times the legal amount walking away because the attorneys can convince the juries that they built up their tolerance so they're no longer impaired. And that's on a blood test. Now, here's why I'm talking about blood, because we don't do blood in the workplace. So this guy, Robert, is being told, you need to change the oral fluid to 5 nanograms instead of 1 because that's what they do in Colorado. That's the DUI standard. And Robert says, I've heard you speak. I don't know anything else to tell him besides it's not based on anything. And I said, okay, so here's the deal. Nanograms in blood for THC versus nanograms in oral fluid for THC versus nanograms in urine for THC versus nanograms in hair for THC are confusing because we call them all THC and we call them all nanograms. but they are not even the same metabolite. Hair metabolite, urine metabolite, oral fluid saliva metabolite, active whole blood metabolite, they're not the same. And I talked to the toxicologist about this and I said, okay, so it's apples to oranges. And they go, no, 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 no. It's like not even apples to eggs because those are in the same food group. It's like eggs to golf balls. Oh. So you want to change a cutoff level for a blood DUI standard in an oral fluid test. And again, you don't know what that means and it means nothing. And so we can't compare them straight across. But I have people all the time going, well, how come they show 100 nanograms in the hair, but they only show 25 nanograms in the urine? Something's wrong there. No, that's the measurement. Measurement is the measurement. And we don't have a straight across. There's no chart or table for straight across. They don't work that way. So we just don't have it. So that roadside standard, and I don't know what Illinois will come up with. I have no idea. Most states just say, well, Colorado has figured this out and studied it, so we should do that. Some have chosen to go with the 2 nanogram, but if you hear that 5 nanogram thing, I just want you to have that history and background. Okay, make sure that you use the proper testing matrix. You need to use the proper testing matrix because, again, I've already explained, you're doing it for different things. Here is history. The oral fluid, less invasive. You cannot cheat it, always observed. You don't need a restroom. Again, the 15 to 24-hour window. DOT is considering adding oral fluid. In fact, Congress has told them to do it. It's working through the HHS standards right now for split specimen and for lab procedures and for this and that. There are only 2 currently approved lab-based oral fluid devices. Those are the ones you should use. You should not just use anything. Some oral fluid devices off the market, like especially the rapid test, don't even pick up THC. So you need to make sure that you are using a good brand.
When it says that it can detect the last 15 to 24 hours, do you mean that prior to the 15 hours?
Yes.
Or if you can't detect it? Or
No, I mean 15 hours from right now. Yeah, prior to right now, not, yeah. Yes, from right now, yes. This is a completely different, oral fluid is the closest thing we have to blood in getting the active metabolite in the oral fluid. So it's a really wonderful test, and that's getting more and more effective and more sophisticated, and over the next 10 years, I believe that we will move largely to oral fluid in the future. Okay, we've already talked about urinalysis. Not only is there no impairment test, which I've mentioned, but toxicologists say it will be 10 years before we have anything close to an impairment test. And then when we're not in a public meeting behind closed doors, like at a conference, we're having lunch, they go, it will never happen. It's impossible. And I say, well, I keep wondering why every 10 years when I come back and say, are we ready, you tell me it'll be 10 more years. That's where we are. So no time soon. Again, we can force it like we did with alcohol. It won't mean a lot. And it will mean nothing unless we absolutely draw a line in the sand and don't let people cross it and contest it like they do in Colorado. So if people say impairment, it doesn't even matter. Okay, perception versus reality. If I don't hire stoners, I'm safe. Listen, my friend Dr. Finn in town said, Jill, the anesthesiologist at the hospital behind me smokes pot regularly. And I'm like, could you just give me his name so I make sure if I ever need surgery, I know who not to go with? You just don't know. I'm going to do this one really quickly. In a pilot study, actually I'll do this one and then we'll take a break. So this will split up, we'll split it into 3 parts overall. So this and then we'll take a break. So this pilot study, I want you to, well, I have the date on the next slide. This was done years ago. Down under, they took pilots and they became proficient in a particular flight simulator. And once everybody was proficient on the flight simulator, they all smoked a joint. This happened. Smoked a marijuana cigarette. So everybody smokes a cigarette, and that's a fun job. And then they get back in the flight simulator in time increments, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour for science. And it's a beautiful study because, they crash. So after these time increments, which are all in the study, they go back to the dorms and they sleep it off. And this was low-grade pot, high is 4 to 6 hours, standard, right? So they come back 24 hours later, they get in the flight simulator. Here's what happened. Low-grade weed. Every one of them had troubles. Difficulty in aligning and landing on the runway, increased vertical and lateral deviation from the flight path, lateral deviation on approach twice. The pre-marijuana test, significant increase in distance from the center of the runway on touchdown. One pilot landed off the runway entirely. Here's the key. Pilots were not aware of any impairment. Look at the year. 1985, prior to the Chase Conrail tragedy. Pilots are not aware of any impairment. When you have people say, I smoke pot all the time, it doesn't affect me a bit. I'm fine. I don't get high. My cousin told me that. I said, then why are you wasting your money? What's the point of that? But there's a doctor, Dr. Ed Gogic, in Phoenix, Arizona, and he treats addicts in prison, and he's done this for 20 years. And he's super special because he's a recovering marijuana addict himself. And so he relates to these guys on this amazing, deep level. And I hear him present sometimes, and he says, marijuana addicts have this weird thing where it's almost like their religion. And I'm talking addicts, and he's like, the drug can do no wrong. And he said they embrace it as a way of life and a culture and a way of thinking, not just as a drug. So like he said, this is what I see. He said, I see heroin addicts hate themselves. They hate the heroin. They hate the fact that this is who they become. They hate that they're addicted to it, and they're ashamed of it. Same with cocaine addicts. Same with, he goes, you could name any alcohol. They hate that. They hate that they love it. But pot, they are committed to it. It is their way of life, it is their God, and you cannot tell them that there is anything wrong with it, and it does not harm them in any way. And I'm seeing that grow and grow and grow as laws change, and it's really fascinating to kind of hear what he told me those years ago and now see it play out. And he said the only way, and I've heard this from repeated people who work in recovery. Dr. Bob DuPont said this just very recently. He said the only way someone who is really embracing marijuana can look back and say, wow, that messed me up, is when they're about a year clean and sober. He said it takes about a year. And then once they're a year out and they look back, they go, who? Because a lot of recovering addicts think that they can stop everything but the pot. So I'll get clean, but then I can just toke a little weed because I can control that. But if the recovery and addiction treatment goes long enough for them to cease for that long, the majority of them will go, yeah, I can't do that. So it's just a fascinating thing, but not aware of any impairment is one of the reasons why we have this, I'm not high, I'm not high, I'm not high, I'm not high. It's not true, it's not true, it's not true. So, and so this is causing a huge argument about impairment, which we're going to talk about when we come back. Take a 10-minute break and we'll pick it up where we left off. Who can be under the influence at work? Who is allowed to be under the influence at work? That's a real thing now. I told you my story about being on the governor's task force and the work group, taxation, banking, and civil law representing employers' rights. There was an attempt before we passed the amendment. All the folks who wrote it and did all that stuff said, nope, employers' rights are strong, they're in place, we're not going to impact you at all. We have very strong employers' rights in the state of Colorado. Drug testing rights are repeated 6 times in our state statutes for, work comp and injury and all those things. And we'll leave that alone, won't change anything, so okay, fine, we feel comfortable about that, right? Well then, of course, and this is all public record recording, you can find it in the archives, they said, well, we had to say that to get it passed, that was not the intent. Notice we did not use the word prohibit, we used the word limit. An employer should have the right to limit. I used to put all the language in the presentation, and then someone told me, we don't need all the language, that's really boring. But the story's great, we just, stop printing the whole thing in there. But So the law says employers have the right to limit marijuana use as they see fit. And they go, well, limit does not mean prohibit, although when you look it up in the dictionary, the first meaning is prohibit, but if you look in some, 23rd version of the dictionary, it says, like to set a smaller standard. So, so employers should be able to limit, but they should not be allowed to prohibit. And so they said everywhere in Colorado law that does not agree with Amendment 64 and our employees, remember, we changed our state constitution. Okay. Anywhere that limits an employee's constitutional right to use marijuana in the state of Colorado should be stricken from Colorado law. Now, the committee did not agree to that, but it was slim because there was then weeks and weeks of debate ensued, to which a minority report was attached. That is public record. That is what I have on file. And that document states their argument that this is an employee's right, constitutional right to use any substances that they choose versus an employer's right to drug test. And the argument should be who may be impaired in the workplace rather than who may not be impaired in the workplace. Now, as preposterous as that may sound to you, and I kind of come at it from a different approach if I write your drug policy, but I'm saying that so that you can understand that's the worldview that we are forced to comply with at some level. And so ask yourself the question, and this is a really good exercise, who in my workforce can be under the influence at work? And these are the signs and symptoms of marijuana use. So where should that be okay? And so I've had these, philosophical debates with people who are trying to convince me and win me over to their side. And I've said, so the accountant, yes, that's a good example. The accountant is not doing anything safety sensitive. They should be able to be under the influence at work. Well, I don't want my accountant stoned, but if you want that guy to do your books, or lady, okay, so which one of these things are you? I'm in drug testing, you guys. I've seen the lady that sits answering the phone falling out of her chair, slurring her speech, half carried in by the HR staff to do a reasonable cause test because she's out of her gourd. Is that safe? Is that okay? Is that what we want? Is it, So the arguments are specious, but we're kind of forced into justifying who can and cannot be under the influence at work. So that's where we are. What's the big deal about a policy, right? So I'm doing this policy workshop that you're in today for a group in Carson City, Nevada, and it was one of the rare occasions where I had easy access to the internet because we were at the chamber and they had a smart board and it was really awesome. And so I said, there's this entire culture on the internet, a subculture of drug users who out companies that don't do drug testing and have lax policies and whatever. And it's super easy to find, and they know you and they identify you and they talk about you, and it's a big deal. And if you don't believe me, and I type in, where can I get a job in Carson City, Nevada? Was it Carson City or Reno? Reno. And where can I get a job in Reno and use drugs? Super simple. And so all of these sites, hundreds of sites pulled up. I didn't count them all, but there's a lot. Pages and pages and pages. So I picked the first one, and I opened it up. And so as you can see, they're listed by type. Customer service, where do they allow a felony? Is it an information job, an administrative job, a warehouse job, a retail job? Is it the Alorica call center? By name. Warehouse, $15 an hour jobs, administrative, Walmart. How'd you like to make this list? Construction, Dignity Health. That's the hospital. CNA jobs, mechanic, assembler. Get it? Okay. So the guy in the front row goes, he goes, click on that warehouse one. That's my profession. So I click on it. He's number 2. Now not only did he make the list, but if your company's on there, you read through the companies, then the users go through and they put comments of what makes this a drug-friendly job. And so the first guy, which is his buddy that he knows, his competitor, but they're also friends, his comments under there, so we click on it, and the comments say, this job is great, they don't care, they allow anything, they don't pre-employment drug test, we deal drugs right off the back dock and nobody cares. And he goes, oh no, I'm sure they would really care. Let's look at yours. Are you okay with that? And he goes, yeah, click on mine. I click on his and it says, the pre-employment drug test, it's easy to cheat, after that they don't care. Anything's cool. And I said, are you cool with it? And he goes, I am not cool with it. And I said, do you have a random drug testing program? And he goes, no. And I said, then you're cool with it. Because see, there's perception and there's reality, and we always say perception is reality, but here's what happens. And so this is just common in the drug use culture. Silence is permission, right? So unless you want to make the list, you need to think about what your part in that subculture will be. Okay, we've already talked about, I believe, removing THC from the drug screen. Is it a good idea or a bad idea? It's an extremely bad idea. You become liable and culpable. You remove THC from the drug test panel, like people in Denver are doing, many in California are doing. Accident, injury, fatality. 40% of all workplace fatalities are caused by employee substance use. Remember that? A fatality occurs, you took THC off the drug test panel, you are liable, you are culpable. Good idea or bad idea? Don't take the risk. It's not worth the risk to your way of life. Increasing the THC limit, how much is enough, how much is too much, we don't know. What about allowing recreational use of other drugs? If you're going to do one, why not do them all? I know that sounds ridiculous, but I will also tell, think about it this way. If marijuana is medical and it's medicine and we're using it for medicine, why not have recreational use of oxycodone? And I know we've already crossed that bridge here because now it's legal, but I'm telling you, guess what? The city of Denver just made magic mushrooms legal for medical purposes. And our governor, who is a huge advocate in the cannabis industry, he's part of the industry, I think yours is as well. Our governor, within 30 days of taking office, decriminalized all illicit drugs for personal use and possession. And nobody knows it, but I have the headlines. And I called DOT and I said, hey, did you know this happened? And they go, no, that didn't happen. And I go, well, here's the story. And they go, oh my God, how come nobody heard about this? Because it's very quiet. But that is coming. And so you compromise on this. Are you going to compromise on heroin? Are you going to compromise on THC? Are you going to compromise on meth? None of us are going to compromise on opiates because we know they're bad. Right? We got to get our heads on straight here. Okay, so let's see. What's my next one? Medicinal use of, other illicit drugs or alcohol. Well, this one, I really like this. Initially, when alcohol was being popularized for commercial use, this is the first commercialization of alcohol. So, you can see all the wonderful benefits and everything. We also have ads like this for cocaine that say cures asthma and all these. We have these for cigarettes. We have ads like this for cigarettes that say they cure asthma. And it's not recommended for children under the age of 9, right? So historically, this whole scenario has been played out. And so we got to keep our heads on straight and realize it impairs, it's an impairing drug. It's not safe. This is about safety first. Okay, so we do have solutions. So this is what I want you to consider while we go through the policy stuff. We can have zero tolerance, but still have options. Now, your state law, which we'll go through in more depth in the next presentation, you have to be very careful about this pre-employment test situation now. You can't just blanket not hire people. for failing the THC test. You're not allowed to do that. So there has to be certain circumstances, like you already have to have a conditional job offer, which we used to recommend against, because if you did a conditional job offer and then you told them they had to leave because they failed a drug test, they could sue you for unemployment, and we've had several people win those successfully and become on unemployment. So we recommended against that, but now the states are going, well, that sounds like a good idea, so we'll do that. So your hands are tied as an employer. But other options that, well, I have recommended, but I don't know if it applies to you anymore, is, reapply in 30 days, pending the drug screen. So maybe if you have a conditional offer of employment, and then they fail the drug test, and then you say, well, before we start you, especially if it's safety sensitive, we want to give it 30 days, get clean, and then you can come back, we'll do another drug test. And then you could maybe do that, unpaid, I don't know. But I would say consult your attorney on that to see if that's allowable. You could do suspensions, paid or unpaid, for positive drug tests rather than straight up firing. By the way, people who, I don't want to fail to mention this in the success of drug testing, is that minorities, especially low income minorities, get more jobs and higher pay when a company does mandatory drug testing. Drug testing is good for minorities, believe it or not. That is a research study. And it was actually published and publicized a few years ago. So zero tolerance. Zero tolerance for under the influence at work. So my other point was, people who have been allowed to go through treatment and recovery after failing a drug test and having an evaluation to see if they've just broke the rules or have an addiction, when they come back, they're better employees than your sober employees. They're more committed, they miss less days of work, they're more productive, they're more loyal and committed, they stay longer than your sober employees who have never used drugs. So it's worth it to invest in the person who will get serious about and do their treatment. And sometimes I have people that are in recovery in my audiences, and they come up to me afterward and say, nobody knows that I'm in recovery in my workplace, but you are right, like all of us in the upper management, like there's a good majority of us that are recovering addicts from back in the day. And so they make, typically, it's not a stereotypical thing. There's always the chance of relapse, but take a chance. You got to increase random drug testing programs, and I'm going to get into that more in the next presentation. I do believe that we're in a day where you have to very carefully define who is safety sensitive and who is not in your workplace. The marijuana industry says, the Cannabis Council specifically, says that you must have an individual job description for every single position, and that job description must state whether or not that particular position may operate under the influence. Now, I've been the person who had to write the job descriptions, and that's a pain in the butt. And I don't know what to say to that. I would hate to think we've come to the day where you have to isolate every single position. Depending, if you have 8 employees, that's not hard. But if you've got 50, it's getting tough unless they all do the same thing. But that's what the industry says, is you have to justify it. So I don't put that up there as a you must do this. I'm just telling you that's kind of like word on the street is what they want you to have to do. Again, federally illegal, which stands for DOT for sure, medical and recreational, DOT, zero tolerance. We used to say you can drop this in your policy as a blanket. We do not do that anymore. I'll address that more on the next one. And where's Jordan? Okay, I'm almost done. So you still have the right to safe and drug-free workplace, which is a federal act. And I don't know if you know that it's a federal act. It is absolutely a federal act. So if you are in a workplace that takes federal dollars, you are mandated to abide by the Safe and Drug-Free Workplace Act. The trouble with the act is it doesn't have any teeth. There's no enforcement arm. Unless something bad happens and there's an accident or fatality that happened with their money, and then they find out that you haven't been enforcing your policy, then you get in trouble for lying about that. Because I know right now all you have to do is check a little box on your annual review that says, yes, we do this. So you better do it if you say you're going to do it, because if you don't, then you're going to get in a lot of trouble. But other than that, It's just a really, really, really good idea. That having been said, courts have upheld the fact that employers have the right to a safe and drug-free workplace. It is your responsibility to have a safe and drug-free workplace, focus on the safe, safe, safe. And one of the reasons for that is that the reason that that act came into being was because of employees who were getting injured permanently by their coworkers who chose to use drugs. They were victims. And when those people were looked at, the federal government, in order to put protections around those people, said, employers, you must have a safe and drug-free workplace to protect these vulnerable peoples. Now, in this day and age, we say employers have the right to a safe and drug-free workplace. And I go to DC and I fight for your rights as an employer, and I will, and I believe in it, and I wholeheartedly support it. But I also want everybody to know that it is your responsibility, because we really are about protecting the employees. That should be the heart of what we do. And if you do not, okay, so how many of you have your workplace offers an EAP program? Good, good, good. Okay, if you do not, I know it can be costly to add that benefit. Find out if you can be a part of a network, a co-op, a something to have an EAP program in place. We see huge success rates for companies that have EAPs and make them available to employees. The challenge is always getting employees to use them, but in cultures where it is encouraged and they are used, we see great deals of success. And that goes into the whole other conversation about, people in recovery make great employees. I'm going to talk more about that later as well. At the end of the day, when I say it is your responsibility to protect people, we want them going home every day at the end of the day to the husband, to the wife, to the child, to the mom, to the dad, to the roommate, to the life partner. And I want you to know just one sliver of one thing about me. I talk a lot about this topic professionally. And I think you figured out by now, I know this like the back of my hand. I've probably done this particular presentation 1,000 times. And I am also the mother of an addict whose drug of choice is marijuana. And sometimes when we have a whole lot of time, I show slides of my son. My middle child, I have 3 children. Stephen's the wild child, he's the oldest. He came out of the womb breaking every rule that God ever made. And me, I was inconsequential. Jordan was the straight-laced stickler, stick to the rules, high type A. They were like flip-flopped in their birth order personalities. And I would leave Stephen to babysit the kids when he was a teenager, but we always said, Jordan, you're actually in charge. You call us if Stephen does anything, because you know. And then Sarah, my third, they're all 3 years apart, so they're 30, 27, and 24. Sarah's the life of the party, but she's the good girl. And so they are as radically different as they can be. Jordan was my high-performing, highly academic, straight-A student who would, in first grade, his teacher had to give him homework to not have homework when there wasn't homework because he would cry thinking he was missing homework. That's how wound up he was. We used to have to do breathing exercises at 4, 5, 6, so he wouldn't have panic attacks over things like that. Very meticulous. He was never diagnosed with OCD, but we do think it was underlying. He was the kid that would put hand sanitizer on the shopping list to make sure I didn't forget, right? And imagine my shock when Jordan was 17 years old, and one Friday night at 2 o'clock in the morning, his older brother came and woke me up from a dead sleep and said, Mom, you've got to come downstairs. Jordan just tried to hang himself in the basement. What? I ran downstairs, and he is sitting on his bed with deep ligature marks in his neck and just stone, stoic. And I jumped up on his bed and I got in front of his face and he wouldn't make eye contact. And I said, Jordy, what happened? And he wouldn't talk, wouldn't do anything. And Stephen, their room was in the basement. He woke up in the middle of the night. The closet light was on. He couldn't figure out what was going on. He went in to shut it off. Jordan was hanging by a belt from the rafter. And he got his brother down and saved his life with a paralyzed arm. We don't know how that happened, except it's a God thing. But Jordan hates him to this day. They don't speak. Took Jordan to mental health services. They did an evaluation. They said he needs to go to the emergency room. We have no beds. We're full. This is prior to Amendment 64, guys. So we go to the emergency room. We're there for hours and hours. Finally, I have to leave. They evaluate him. I come back. I have to leave. Finally, the hospital social worker comes and said, Mrs. McGuire, we need to talk about Jordan. Step into my office. We sit down. She says, we really need to address his marijuana use. And I, who normally said, oh yeah, my kid did that, whatever we got to do, said, Jordan does not use marijuana. And one of these moms, she goes, well, according to him, he's using a lot. And I said, he's lying. And you could just see her face like, oh no. And I'm embarrassed about that to this day, but I had no clue. No clue. Because my kid, who put hand sanitizer on the shopping list, also would put Febreze on the shopping list. And so he had it covered, right? I was clueless. And that began a 2-year journey of what I thought was hell, going to treatment, getting out of treatment, going back to pot, going to treatment, getting out of treatment, having a mental health breakdown, having another suicide attempt, assaulting a cop, going to treatment. And you know what? Because I worked for the school safety program in my state and I knew all the cops and they were friends of mine, they would go, Joe, we know your family, we know you as a person, we're not going to put him in jail, just take him home. Well, then what started happening? He'd run away. So now he's a runaway. So now I'm going and registering him as a runaway and making sure he doesn't have his driver's license and this and that, and blah, blah, blah. So then eventually, at the end of the day, it came to a point where, this just kept compiling. We ended up finding a cache of stolen weapons in our home with ammunition. Now I got a kid on drugs who's angry with weapons. Guys, I work for a school safety program. That's the signs of a shooter. My family's in danger. Cops come to my house. Serial numbers are scraped off. This is a felony. And that cop sat across my dining room table with this huge cache of weapons. And I'm just so shocked. And he said, is that a good girl right there? Points to my daughter. And I said, yes, sir, she's a very good girl, 16 years of age. He said, do you want her to stay that way? And I said, of course. He said, I can't tell you what to do. I cannot, but I gotta tell you, if that was my kid out there, he would never set another foot in this house. Because either you won't survive it, or she's gonna go down the same path. And I knew, all my training and everything I've been teaching all around the state for the last years just clicked in my head, and I was like, oh my God, it's right in front of my face. And I walked upstairs, and I found a backpack that was empty, and I went for clean underwear, pair of jeans, sweatshirt, went down to the kitchen, got granola bars, let's get a toothbrush, and I went out on the front step and I handed it to him, and I said, I love you with all my heart, but you can't come back here. That's when hell started. For the next 4 years, he lived on the streets. Went to LA, will work for food. First time I saw him come through a bus station on his way to the other side of the country, didn't even recognize him. He was the homeless guy on the side of the street, and he stank. And it just was not my kid. And I had to stand there and I had to go, I am that mom. I am that mom. I raised an addict. I did that. And it was hard. We lost our whole church family over it because nobody wanted to touch it. It was scary. It was devastating. And I want you to know that Jordan is now in my house at 27 years of age. He's working so hard. He's working to recover his driver's license. He's been through 2 years of intensive treatment for that. He has a fiance. He's just got promoted to manager. Kid's killing it. It's a miracle. I'd given him up for dead. But what made the difference? He finally decided to get a job. And he had an employer who said, you're going to have to pass a drug test. And he has an employer who says, if you want to do this manager job, you stay drug-free, because he knows Jordan's history. And Jordan says, yes. Folks, you impact moms who couldn't make a difference, who do this job and couldn't make a difference. You impact baby sisters who lost their best friend. You impact the dad who gave up hope and lost his entire family because he couldn't deal with it anymore. You impact the big brother who knows that someday he'll have that relationship again. This matters. You save lives every day. I don't care if you're just doing manufacturing or desk jobs. People get in their cars and they go home. You save lives every day. This matters. Safe and drug-free workplace is not just about a piece of paper. It matters. First of all, I am not a lawyer, and that's important. Usually I print out pieces of paper and have everyone sign them. I have a stack of those at home, and I keep thinking, I don't know what I'm going to do with those. But the reality of it is, I'm going to tell you so much about writing a policy today, and it's such valuable information. But if you have an attorney, you need to run it by your attorney. And they may disagree with me, but if they disagree with me and you feel strongly about it, please have them call me and argue with me about it, because sometimes attorneys get this very wrong. And I'll give you some examples. Sometimes they've got it really right, but attorneys, for the most part, they don't know anything about drug testing unless they really work in that venue. So you got to run everything by an attorney, and don't say Joe said, because Joe said doesn't hold up in court. All right, so again, we talked about this, safety-sensitive thing and why each position. I've already talked to the. Okay, so I want you to pay attention to this EEOC. Equal Opportunity Act says you must be able to show that the employee's inability or impaired ability to perform a job-related task could result in a direct threat. Now, that does not apply to drugs and alcohol at all. It's the Equal Opportunity Act, and it is for disabilities. But we are starting to see lawsuits, which I'm going to show you in a second, that are starting to compare rights of marijuana to AADA. And so I just want you to, if you go this route, I want you to think about that. Okay. All right. These are the things that will strengthen your options of winning a lawsuit. And that's how we're going to come about this, right? So do not ever implement, you may not, by any measure in any state, implement a drug and alcohol testing without your employees knowing about it. And first of all, if you're doing any kind of drug and alcohol testing on any level at any point without a policy, you're going to get sued and you're going to lose bad and pay for it. You have to have a policy before you can do a drug test, and the people have to be notified about it, because it's been argued in court, and it was argued for years and years when DOT was trying to implement the rules. That's why Reagan had to force it, because this was tied up in court. Because they were going to do it earlier, and they couldn't, because the attorneys came to the Supreme Court and said drug testing falls under the constitutional amendment of search and seizure. you are doing a legal search and seizure of someone's personal material possession, and that's breaking the Constitution, therefore drug testing is not constitutional. And so that was all hung up, and then it was ruled that, not that it doesn't, not apply to the constitutional amendment, but that the need for public health and safety is greater. So the way that this has been a workaround for these decades, 30 years, is that you have to have notification first. This is your notification, is your policy. So you must have it, you must communicate it. The best method is to have an employee sign something that states they have read it. Usually on your pre-employment, you have something that says I have read and agree, right, to your general policy. If you want to break out your drugs and policy, drug and alcohol policy specifically for that, it's just an added layer of protection, but you need to have something that shows that they understand. Avoid throwing consequences on a case-by-case basis into your policy left and right. I had someone ask me to review their policy a couple of years ago, and it was written in like 1978, and they hadn't pulled it out of the drawer since then. And by the way, this may be a slide in the future, but I'm just going to say it while I'm thinking of it. If your policy, obviously you're here, so this is not the case with you, but if you've ever been that person, where your policy is somewhere in a file cabinet in another room and you don't know exactly where it is or what it says, and you plan to pull it out if anything comes up, but it hasn't, so who cares? That's wrong. You need to have it. You need to know it. It needs to be accessible. You need to, because you get in a reasonable cause situation, and you're trying to go find that lost, outdated policy before you know what to do, that's a disaster. It doesn't happen that way. It happens in real time and it happens quickly. And secondly, most people don't bother because they don't have time, so they just play it by ear. So when you play it by ear, what happens? The next time it happens, and it will now because we're in a whole new day, the next time it happens, you're going to do something completely different. And then, and I've seen this, I'll tell you a story, but I'm going to go a little quickly here. Employee A will find out. And when they find out that you handled employee B differently, you get sued and you lose. Okay, and you've got a discrimination law, so you got to pay attention to that. All right, under the influence versus impaired. Now, I already told you about all the problems with the impairment test, right? So this is a huge, huge issue, and this is one of your most valuable takeaways of this day. If your policy uses impairment as a standard in any way, shape, or form in your policy language, take it out, because you can't prove impairment by law. That's what's happening in the courts with our DUI cases. Attorneys say you can't prove impairment, your policy says impairment, therefore you can't prove it, therefore you were wrong. All right, so change that to under the influence. You're fine to say that impairment is not, tolerated or something like that, like in a general sense, like your opening statement. But when it comes to any employee that is impaired shall be any employee found to be under the influence, right? You go that way, or you're going to get sued, and you're going to lose. All right. Again, I've said use certified collections professionals. There are certifications. There are professionals. If you're doing them yourself, you don't know what you're doing, which is fine if you're not DOT. If you're DOT, that's illegal, so you better know that. If you're non-DOT, you can do them yourself, but you need to call someone who knows how to do it and get trained. I support on-site drug testing, but someone needs to know. Also, it's very difficult to do it in-house because people will say that you're discriminating against them because you're friends with this person. And it's their fault they failed the drug test, but they'll still blame you. So it's just, if you want to, again, another layer of protection, use a third-party collector. And you have the right, in fact, okay, so under DOT, now, the reason I'm mentioning DOT a lot, you already know DOT is a federal law on drug testing. There's no other law. That's it. That's all there is. Some states have a few things about drug testing. Your state has a few things about drug testing. Some, mostly silent. All we have is DOT. So for anybody that does not apply under DOT, it's still the best practice is what we have. So one of the things that I'll do is I go through these, I'll say for DOT this, for non-DOT you can do this, but I would recommend this. So that's why I'm going to compare it, because that is the law that we have for 30 years. Okay, so that, if that makes sense. So So certified collections professionals are mandated under DOT. We have a training program, and so you get with someone who knows how to do that, to spot cheaters and what they're doing, and then we have these things. I've already talked to you about correct testing products, perform the right type of drug test, and what I mean by that is the trucking industry is on DOT to add hair testing, and I think they'll be successful in the long term, but oral fluid is first, so it'll be another decade or so. And so they asked me to do a webinar for them 2 years ago on hair testing, which I did, and then they said, well, wait, in the Q&A, you said not to do hair testing on post-accident, and that's what we want it for. I said, you can't do a hair test on post-accident. Why not? That's what we want. We catch more on hair. We have science that shows that hair is really effective, blah, blah, blah. It's great. But how many of you know hair testing is hair follicle testing? Heard hair follicle testing? Okay, some of you. The follicle's under the skin. We don't test the follicle. We'd have to rip the hair out by the roots. We test the shaft of the hair, this part. So the drug has grown out into the protein of the hair. And that's how we get it. Now, we cut it as close to the scalp as we can get it, and you need about the width of a straw, not a McDonald's straw, a regular straw, okay? And we don't cut a chunk, we cut a sliver so they don't have a big bald spot. If anybody does that to you, you call me. So we do a sliver so it's undetectable. And so we get this width, and so the shaft is tested. Now, even if we are able to cut as close to the scalp as we can, the drug is resting in the follicle. That is true. The drug is in the follicle. That's where it sits. But it takes 3 to 5 days for that to grow out into the shaft of the hair. 3 to 5 days. So if you try to go in, now the rest of this, when we test what we're getting from the close to the skin as we can, let's say we do an inch is safely 30 days. It's actually 1/4 of an inch per 30 days. So if you get an inch, you really can do 90 days. But let's say we're going to do an inch for 30 days. You're getting history. And again, you're getting that, capturing that chronic use. You're getting a habitual pattern of behavior. So I have employees that call me, the hair test came up positive. I want to know what they did, how much they did, how they used it, and when. No, all we know is they did. That's all. That's 100% all we know. And any forensic toxicologist will go to court and testify to that. That's as far as this goes, okay? So you do a post-accident hair test, you don't know what happened in the last 3 to 5 days. This truly could have been weeks ago. Now, does it give you it tells you a story. Yes, it's a story of chronic use, yes, but you cannot prove impairment by that by any means, because you can't tell if it was recent, and attorneys know that. They know it. You try to do a hair for post-accident, you lose. So urine or oral fluid for post-accident, hair is for history, great on pre-employment, great on random, really great on random, not good for pre-employment. So the correct testing products, the right type of test, and then use a medical review officer, which we'll talk about at the end a little more. Okay, so these are best practices. I already talked about DOT. It is best practice federal mandate. Let's see, I think I've already said, okay, repeatedly upheld in courts of law. DOT has stood the test of time for 30 years, so we can hang our hats on it. Your policy is your rule of practice. It provides clarity of expectations, consequences for violations, which you need to know what those are. And I know that's hard to do, but you know what? You can change that. If you try a set of consequences and you go, that's not working, that's not what we want to do, it's okay to make a formal policy change. Just notify the employees, let them know, communicate it, and then do it every time. Don't accidentally do it the old way. Do it whatever way you do. It's a living, breathing document. It creates accountability, and again, it's also about liability. Okay, so every one of these cases, and these are like the big ones. There are many of these. There's dozens and dozens of these. Every one of these cases are a case where an employee sued an employer for being fired over the use of medical marijuana. And these all went up to the state Supreme Court. So every one of these rulings are state Supreme Court cases that was won by the employer. Multiple states are represented, and the employers won in every single one of these cases because they had the same things in place. These are the things they had in place. They had a clearly written drug and alcohol policy. They had communicated that policy effectively and had proof that the policy had been communicated by a signature page of the employee. They regularly and consistently communicated that policy on a regular basis at trainings through the year, which there were sign-in sheets, and they could prove that they had talked about this, the employees were there and heard it. They had a drug testing policy that they used, drug testing program, that they used regularly, and the employees were well aware. Those 4 things were solid gold. Now we're getting into some very slippery areas where that is more and more not the case. So we're going to talk about that. But this used to be where I stopped that part of the presentation and didn't have to go any further. This is what has happened in the last 2 years. And boy, is it a whole new day. So you have Rhode Island, you have Massachusetts, you have Connecticut, you have Arizona, you have New Jersey, you have Arkansas, you have Oklahoma, and again, I mentioned New York City earlier, who have all had rulings that either the drug testing for medical marijuana patients is discriminatory and falls under the ADA. At the Supreme Court level in that state, they're beginning to protect medical marijuana under ADA. It does not on paper qualify, but here we are. If a judge decides, now there's precedent. And now they're treating it like ADA. So when I started doing this presentation a few years ago, when I was asked to do something along these lines, so I created this workshop, and when I went to do it for the very first time, I said, strong employers' rights, and you put that federal language in your policy that, zero tolerance and Schedule 1 and all this, and that's the golden ticket, and we're good. And the first state that did discrimination against medical marijuana was Nevada, so I went to all the attorneys that are on the State Attorneys Council, because there's not that many there, and I called them up, and I said, do you agree? Because I read their presentation that they did. I said, do you agree with the summary on the presentation? Do you? Yes, yes, yes. So the patent agreement was the discrimination that they've mentioned in this law does not apply to ADA, and ADA does not apply to it. So you don't have to worry about that. Well, now the rulings are ADA. So now when we talk about discrimination, I'm going to go to ADA. So it is what it is. So there we are, and some are calling it a Compassionate Care Act and whatnot, but things are changing, and some states are putting this on a broad level. You can't discriminate in pre-employment and all this stuff. So it's just a new day, and you need to know your law, and you need to know it really carefully. If you choose to make an allowance in your policy for those who have a medical marijuana card, compassionate care and whatnot, you need to be very, very, very specific. If you say you have a card, and we understand you're going to fail your drug test, and we're going to allow it because you're severely ill and, whatnot. Very specific. Define it so carefully because it will open the door, and then it will open the door for abuse. Be consistent, safety sensitive, never qualifies for this. Never, never. Keep detailed documentation of your accommodations. Okay, let's go into your state law. Illinois does not encourage or prohibit testing. Employers have the right to a drug-free workplace according to recent reports. It is not illegal for employers to require testing for those who have been or are in a drug rehab program. You're allowed to do that. There is a discrimination law. And in your state, prescribed medication has ADA protections, and that means legal prescription, opiates. But singling out protected groups of age, race, gender, etc. Is illegal, of course. That's discrimination. The discrimination is not very well defined when it comes to marijuana. Even though it's there pertaining to marijuana, it doesn't address marijuana. Although one thing it says you can't fire an employee just because they have a medical marijuana card, which was covered, and you must protect privacy at all times. You can't make the records public. So what I'm seeing, and I have the references here, a potential employee can be drug tested, providing they have been given a conditional job offer based on the drug testing results. Okay, any employer that receives funding from the federal government must require a drug test, and so that's fine. Employers desiring to receive the funding to promote their drug-free work environment must comply with drug test rules, drug-free work environment. Employers receiving funding must set up an awareness program delineating the harmful effects of drugs. It also says that if you are a nonprofit that is in any way educating the public on drug use, you are allowed to test and fire for drug use. You must provide a written policy of drug-free regulations to each employee and post a copy of the regulations where all employees will have access to it. You might want to take a picture of that slide. Employers must provide a written statement of the penalties imposed for failure to pass a drug test. Employees testing positive for drugs or alcohol must be given the opportunity for rehabilitation, counseling, or treatment. Must. Potential employees who fail the drug test will have their job offer withdrawn. So you have to do a conditional offer of employment, and then if they fail, then you can withdraw. That's what this says at this point. So one thing I also want to mention, I don't know if I put it somewhere else in here, so I'm just going to say it. Attempting to cheat a drug test in your state is illegal. Did you know that? It's illegal. It's against the law here. You're one of, like, I think 8 states that has that on the books. So if someone attempts to or tries to cheat the drug test and is caught to have a synthetic substitute product or whatever, that's a reportable offense. Okay, so again, does ADA apply or not? Well, we don't know, but some judges are saying so. So let's see what ADA says you must do if you have a person with a disability. So it does not require any employer to accommodate or allow the medical use of marijuana in the workplace. Oh, this is your Illinois state law still, sorry. It does not require an employer to modify the job. This is a direct comparison with ADA. To modify the job or working conditions of a person who engages in the medical use of marijuana that are based upon the reasonable business purposes of the employer. So you don't have to modify if it's not reasonable to what you do every day in the workplace. But you must attempt to make a reasonable accommodation for the medical needs of an employee who engages in the medical use of marijuana if the employee holds a valid registry identification card, provided that such reasonable accommodation would not pose a threat of harm or danger to persons or property, or impose an undue hardship on the employer. Those are key words, undue hardship on the employer. What does that mean? You have to define it and articulate it, which you can, but you have to write it out. And as long as it would not prohibit the employee from fulfilling any and all of his or her job responsibilities. So you've got to attempt and document it. Day and age, everything needs to be documented, okay? Furthermore, the ADA law does not require an employer to provide health care to pay for medical marijuana. It does not require an employer to allow the use of medical marijuana at work. It does not require an employer to modify the job or working conditions of a person who uses medical marijuana. So there's a contradiction there. You have to attempt, but you're not required to. Okay? Keep that straight. So, if the modification creates a threat of harm to persons or property, creates an undue hardship for the employer, prohibits the employee from completing any assigned duties and responsibilities, which we already read that standard language in the ADA, as we already read. Okay, so some examples of reasonable accommodation by the EEOC for ADA, a lot of acronyms, but I think you're with me. For ADA, you must attempt to allow the employee to work from home. Now, this isn't the medical marijuana law, this is just ADA. I don't know if someone's going to say this applies, but that could be a big can of worms. Try to make existing facilities readily accessible by individuals with disabilities. That doesn't apply. Job restructuring to part-time or modified work schedules, reassignment to a vacant position, meh. Acquisition or modification of equipment or devices, meh. Appropriate adjustment of modification of examinations, trainings, materials, or policies, well, that's interesting. Will that apply? Will that not apply? You must try to provide qualified readers or interpreters, does not apply. All right. It is against the law or illegal in Illinois to possess, manufacture, or sell substances or methods that help people cheat on drug tests. This includes synthetic urine, adulterants, devices intended to help people smuggle these things in. Let's see, for the purpose of the section, drug and alcohol screening test includes, but is not limited to urine, hair, follicle, rip that hair out, perspiration testing, which there is a sweat patch, kind of out of use, saliva test, blood testing, fingernail testing, and eye drug testing, which I have no idea what that is. Don't ask me, never heard of it. But it's in your law, so maybe it's a Back to the Future thing. A violation of this section is class 4 felony, for which the court shall impose a minimum fine of $1,000. You gotta report that sucker. Okay, so we know Illinois law. Took pictures. You'll get the presentation. Consult your attorney. Okay, earmarks of a good policy. Let's dive in. Your workplace drug and alcohol policy. It creates a culture, as you've seen by the slide of where can I get a drug-friendly job. It provides clarity. It needs to be complete in scope and nature. I have people ask me to review their policies and they send me 3 paragraphs. No, that's not going to do it. It needs to be consistent. You can't say you're going to do one thing with this set of drugs, another thing with that set of drugs, or one thing with this people group and that thing, whatever. And you need to communicate effectively, as we've discussed. Now, I do want to mention that if you have DOT and non-DOT employees, even if you have a fleet of folks that are on the road in their truck, and then you have 3 people in the office managing them or whatnot, you must have a DOT policy that is separate from your non-DOT policy. They can be identical in scope and nature, but one says DOT and follows those rules, and the other one says non-DOT and is different in that scope, okay? So you just have to know that. Okay, so culture, set the tone you desire for your company environment. What are your company values? That's where you start, is with your value statement. Clarity, I think I've been through these. Don't be vague, avoid gaps. It needs to be complete, but you can leave yourself opportunities. I'll get more into that. Commit to your policy, be consistent. Don't put it out there and then just walk away from it and go do your own thing. Follow through every time. Plan for your communication, review, repeat. I've done that. Okay, policy, content, putting it all together. All right. Questions that you're going to answer. So your opening, what is your purpose or your mission statement for your drug and alcohol policy? I know I say the word mission statement and I always hear this very silent inner groan. I know it's there. Oh God. If you've been through a mission statement writing session, you hate it. This isn't hard, and there's samples, and I'll give you samples of it. But it could be, we want to comply with safe and drug-free workplace laws. We want to protect our employees and make sure they're safe. It's not hard. It's that kind of thing. What is it that you're going for? Because I'll tell you something. Drug testing, as you know, because I've already explained it, it's not here to bust people. But I also want to take that a step further and say, if you're in it to bust people, you have the wrong motive. Drug testing is to protect people. It should be to get people help and to prevent harm and to protect safety, not to be punitive. That's not the goal. And if you're using it punitively, you're going to discriminate and you're going to get sued and you're going to lose. I should make that like I will say you're going to get sued and you're going to lose. I should do that more often. Okay, so how will you make your employees aware of your policy, have a plan? What are the boundaries and expectations? Again, to whom does it pertain? You need to clarify, and we're going to go over that. When, why, and how will you test for substances? Which will be subject to testing? This is so important. What are, again, consequences, and what resources will you provide for those who violate the policy? Okay, purpose, mission statement. Explicitly describe your agency's mission. How will substance use impact the accomplishment of that mission? What do? Do you make widgets, and this is going to make sure that you produce the best widgets, the most widgets, get them done in the right manner, whatever. That's what we're talking about. What does your company do, and how will substance use negatively impact the accomplishment of that mission? Review the adverse impact substance use has or could have on your agency. I fed you some of those. Again, you'll have the slides. Think about personnel records, security clearance revocations, union requirements. You need to think about that. EAP records, merit systems, board actions, those kind of things. Do you need to put any of those into consideration? I'm from a largely non-union state. I don't know a lot about unions. So if I'm working on a policy that's heavily union, I have people that I call for help because I don't know that stuff. It just, collective bargaining, not really a thing in the West. Overall, it's getting there, but large numbers are neither necessary nor essential. And so the preamble focuses on the magnitude of risk for even one employee. Okay, that means it doesn't matter if 75% of your workforce is using drugs or 10% or 1%, the policy needs to be the policy. Okay, so a sample, I'm just gonna, some of these I'll actually skip because you're going to get copies, but one sample. Our company name: we are committed to protecting the safety, health, and well-being of its employees and all people who come into contact with its workplaces and property and or use its products and services. Remember your customers in this. They're vulnerable too. Recognizing that drug and alcohol abuse poses a direct and significant threat to this goal, our company is committed to ensuring a substance-free working environment for all of its employees. Notice I am using the word substance quite a bit there rather than drugs and alcohol because there are so many substances. And we can huff paint, we can whatever, there's so many things. And so some people are saying some things are not a drug. I am hearing marijuana is not a drug. I heard yesterday on a podcast I listened to, they were talking about a girl that was murdered and she went missing. And they said she was arrested for not paying her bill at a restaurant, and when they took her to the police station and tested her for drugs, she was clean, completely drug-free. But then later in the story, they mentioned that they found joints in her car and empty bottles of alcohol, which doesn't mean she used them right at the moment. But then the commentator goes, yes, so when you only have marijuana in your system, you are not on drugs. And I'm hearing kids in high schools tell me that. I go and talk on marijuana impaired driving for Safe Driving Week in our local high schools. And the kids will say, I'm drug-free, I only use marijuana. So we're coming into this, it's not a drug, it's not a drug. So, and you may think that's because they're stupid teenagers, but how many years before you're hiring them? That's their worldview. Okay, so we're gonna say substance-free. This is a longer mission statement, I won't get into it, but employee awareness, some ideas, new employee interviews. These are not like do one of these, this is do all of these. Mention it in the interview, have it in a handbook sign-off sheet, talk about it in orientation, talk about it in a job performance review. Hey, just a reminder, we enforce drug-free workplace policy. Company-wide meetings, safety meetings, that's your key. Safety meetings are really key because those usually happen monthly or quarterly. Any team meetings, it doesn't have to be 100% of them, but it should be regularly a mention or and reminders whenever pertinent. One of the ways that I suggest, especially in safety meetings, is bring up headlines of stories where someone was injured or caused an accident or in an accident or something because of substance use. It doesn't just have to be pot, it could be meth, it could be alcohol, it could be whatever, and just say, I want you all to remember this is not safe behavior. That's it. You don't have to preach about drugs or give them my presentation. You just have to do consistent reminders, okay? Use the headlines, use whatever you can. Okay, so who qualifies in your policy? This is so important. All right, is anyone exempt? Is the president of the company exempt? Which I do not recommend because let me tell you how many presidents of companies fail their drug test. Is it full and part-time or just full-time? It should be full and part-time, but some people take out the part-time. Contractors and subcontractors. I have so many companies that say that that's the contractor's business. But then I was in a group of HR managers, and one of the HR managers, people, raised her hand and said, but we contract with this sales guy, and everybody knows he has a really bad cocaine problem, but he gets the most sales. Right? I mean, you can at least have them sign an agreement, and you may not be liable after that, but to remove your liability from the situation, sales, he's driving all over the region. They need to sign a statement, okay? So you can include that in your policy. If you're a contractor or subcontractor, you're going to abide by your safe and drug-free workplace policy. Maybe you don't have the right to drug test them because they're a subcontractor, but you can at least say they will abide by it and have them sign it, okay? Seasonal employees, don't forget them. Vendors, what about vendors? Does this apply or does it not apply? Sometimes it just completely doesn't apply. But I was working with an event planner, and I don't know what all of you do, and we should have gone around and had everybody introduce themselves, but that would take an hour out of the presentation. I'm not willing to give that to you. So I had a girl in the audience who was an event planner, and they had a huge venue where there were a lot of trade shows. And she said, for years, we didn't care. I mean, like, it wasn't our business. They're a vendor. They come in, they do this, they do that. Then we had an accident, and it happened on our property, and we paid big time. So they have to sign a statement that you're on our property, you will respect our drug-free policies. And now, it doesn't matter if they do or not, we have the statement. So they learn the hard way. That's how this happens. So vendor has a lot of different definitions, and I get it. Can you make sure your UPS man who delivers is always drug-free? No, you cannot. That's a whole other topic because I teach on that situation for sexual harassment. We're not going to go there. But anyway, that applies to them, but not this. Applicants, so you just have to articulate that in your policy. Okay, here's verbiage. This policy applies to all job applicants, full-time and part-time employees, and contract employees of the company when they are on company business or on company premises, including but not limited to all properties, facilities, land, platforms, buildings, structures, fixtures, installations, automobiles, trucks, and other vehicles, whether owned, leased, or used by the company or for company purposes. This policy also covers the use of drugs or alcohol while off company premises if the employee is under the influence as defined in this policy when representing the company. All company property will be subject to search at the discretion of the company. Additionally, regardless of the event or situation, employees are always responsible for their actions and behavior at company-related events or activities. Does that make sense? Any questions? Now, let's see, do I want to go into that? This is defining an applicant. Okay, one of the things I want to say, I was going to, so when you talk about the search of structures, you also need to decide if that applies to vehicles parked on your property, which you may or may not have a constitutional right to search. It can get tricky. If they use their vehicle for company purposes, you do have the right. But I would also check with an attorney on that based on your state law, because your state law could say something different. But generally, if their vehicle is used for company purposes, you can check the vehicle. But if it's company owned, you definitely can. But also think about this. Will that apply to lockers and desks? You own that stuff. That is your property. So you have the right to it. Employees will argue that's illegal search and seizure, that's my property, you can't look in my desk drawer. You can check their email. You own it. You have the right to all of that. And your handbook should say that. Because I'll tell you, the worst thing is when you have an employee quit and their email starts getting routed to you and you find out their car payment has been emailed to work and their bank and they've been doing all their personal business on company email. And so, you own that, and so you got to know how far will that extend. Okay, All applicants are covered. Applicants are not entitled to company-paid retests or any other services that may be made available to employees in this policy unless stipulated by applicable state or federal law. You got to know your state laws when it comes to policy. I know 2 people in this entire country who are state law experts, any state, any law, and when it comes to drug testing, they're experts. They are very expensive to get. But they're great friends, and so I can kind of say, will you tell me what's going on in Illinois and get some good information? But I've asked one guy to come with me because he lives in Chicago, and I've asked him to come with me the next time I speak because they've asked me to address zoning laws in detail, and I'm like, I do workplace, but I know Bill Judge, so I will bring Bill Judge with me. But anyway, you need to consult an attorney about those state laws if you're not clear in any way. I guess most of you probably know that, but it bears repeating. Okay, boundaries and expectations. What is acceptable behavior and what is not? Any drugs, illicit, prescription, or synthetic. Alcohol, paraphernalia. We always forget about the paraphernalia. Being under the influence and unsafe behaviors. Okay. Boundaries and expectation. The company employees are prohibited from being under the influence of drugs as defined in this policy. Could also say substances. A confirmed positive drug test and or demonstrating the signs and symptoms of being under the influence of drugs. And so that's how it's defined in this policy. Being under the influence of alcohol as defined in this policy is a breath alcohol content of 0.2 or higher as demonstrated by an alcohol test and or demonstrating the signs and symptoms of being under the influence of alcohol. And so there's exceptions in the policy later, like being at a company event where alcohol is provided. Testing positive for drugs or alcohol is also prohibited. Failing to notify a supervisor or manager if the employee believes that he or she is under the influence of drugs or alcohol, which can happen. I mean, we're seeing more and more of people getting dosed with marijuana edible unbeknownst to them, and they're just, they're heartbroken because they never would have done this or intended to do it, but someone thinks that was funny. And I gotta tell you, because this is gonna come up, somewhere in this state, it just has to happen because we've had many cases. We had this happen at a college sponsored, it was a college class, I should say, sponsored birthday party for a teacher. Someone dosed the goodies and people got high on campus. And so now our schools have made policies that you cannot bring goodies from home, even our elementary schools. Moms can't bring cupcakes to kids' birthdays. It's a true thing. So this is going to happen. So I am seeing a lot of employers who are firing over that and saying zero tolerance. I don't know if you're lying or telling the truth. And I got to tell you, I believe some of these people are God's honest telling the truth because they're crushed by it. And I think losing their job in that case, I mean, I have to say, if I was them, I would sue because I think that's bull. But, you know, it's hard to be in this position and say that, but use discretion. You have zero tolerance. Like, I get that you can have abuse of that. I totally get that. But you know your people. And that's also a very important part of this. If you are a DOT, I'm stepping on a little bit of the future presentation here, but if you're DOT, you're mandated to know reasonable cause, signs and symptoms, and if you do, then one of the things is you know your people. If you don't know them, you're not going to know whether they're being honest or not being honest, or whether their behavior has changed or not changed. So that's just an important thing. Okay. Bringing illegal drugs or alcohol, controlled substances, or drug paraphernalia to work and or storing such items on company property. These are still things that are prohibited. Possession, use, manufacturing, distributing, or attempting to distribute, sell, or dispense drugs, controlled substances, etc. Abusing prescription drugs, which includes exceeding the recommended prescribed dosage, or others using others' prescribed medications. That's such a common practice. You know, when we grew up in the 70s, my dad didn't have medical insurance, and he worked for the steel mill, and he didn't have medical insurance, and he had 4 kids. So I was the oldest. If I got sick and my mom went to our local doctor, I still remember to this day, just a little local doctor that still made house calls, it was the 70s still, and he gave my mom a big bottle of cough syrup with codeine like this. I took it till I stopped coughing, and then when my sister got sick, she took it till she stopped coughing, and then when my brother got sick, he took it, and then it sat in the fridge until the baby got sick, and the baby got the codeine like everybody else got the codeine. That's what we did in families. In fact, I think he prescribed it to my mother. That's how we did. So coming into this world and learning that using someone else's prescription medication is illegal and illicit drug use, I was like, holy crap, we've been doing that our whole lives. You know, it was like it's still a family practice, really, and not like chronically, but I mean, you know, if I had a dental appointment and I had 3 Vicodin left, and then my husband got a toothache 2 years later, I'd pull that stuff out and say, here, take one of these until you get to the dentist. Who has not done that? Well, if you have someone in specifically a DOT job and they do that, they're losing their job, because that is illicit drug use. So it bears educating people just so that they understand that, because my perception is a lot of people just don't know. Okay, I'm going to move on because you can get into that later. Disclosing information related to a drug or alcohol test result and or substance abuse treatment referrals is exception is except by this policy. Like if you're working with a treatment provider, that's forbidden. What is also forbidden is refusing to cooperate with the terms and conditions of this policy. Failure to cooperate includes, but is not limited to, refusal to test. That means any part of the test. Failure to provide an adequate sample without a valid medical excuse. Refusal to sign required paperwork. You may or may not have that one in there. According to DOT, it's not a refusal to test if you don't sign. But you have to put a note on the document that they refuse to sign, but the drug test still proceeds. Failure to show up at an assigned collection site to provide a specimen, that's considered a refusal. Failure to be reasonably available to be tested once the employee has been notified. Alcohol use. Alcohol use will not be tolerated at the workplace, but may be permitted at the discretion of management. Okay, so this is what you want to do. You want to go for company events where you serve alcohol. You kind of want to go through this checklist. I think it's a really good checklist. Will on-duty alcohol use be permitted? That's kind of like no-brainer. Who can or must authorize on-duty alcohol use? So let's say you close for half the day and have a company picnic and there's beer coolers. You decide who makes that decision. Will drinking be permitted at company-sponsored? So define it, and then that way everybody's clear. And also, who makes that decision? Does anybody need a break? Keep going. Yes, question?
I went to a seminar at an insurance brokerage firm where an attorney was presenting on recommendation around policy similar to today. And I was going to summarize his statement. He was basically saying you should treat your recreational marijuana policy like you do your alcohol policy.
Yes, so the question is, an attorney who did a presentation on policy said you should treat recreational marijuana like you do alcohol. Dead on the money. Dead on the money. Yeah, you don't tolerate people coming to work under the influence of alcohol. You don't tolerate people coming to work under the influence of marijuana.
So how does that mix with all of the social components?
Well, you're going to define, okay, so you're talking about when it's company use? Oh, hell no. Because again, people can drink alcohol and not get drunk. This does not say, will we all be getting drunk? This is adult use of alcohol, but that's not what happens in adult use of marijuana. We get stoned. So you're not allowing impairment. If someone gets impaired, what are you going to do if someone gets impaired? You give them a ride home. So now, I was just telling someone on the break that, that I know of business chambers and city leaders that when they have after-hours functions, attorneys are telling them, don't serve alcohol, serve edibles, because we can get you out of marijuana-related DUIs, but we cannot get you out of alcohol-related DUIs. So it is happening. You just need to choose if you're going to be that guy. I wouldn't, but, you know, look at what you're doing to endanger people, you know, so, yeah, okay, so why will you test? Drug testing is a vital piece of viable policy. It's the enforcement tool, but do consider union agreements or obligations. So the types of testing: pre-employment, random, must be scientifically selected, must. So when we passed Amendment 64, I was asked to be on a call with our state attorney council. And so there was about 200 attorneys on this massive conference call in the state, and they wanted to know how drug testing for marijuana worked and lend me their expertise and blah, blah, blah. So I got on there and we're talking, and I said, what this is going to come down to is reasonable cause testing will be a must. You have to look for the signs and symptoms because there's no impairment test. The signs and symptoms are so important. And one of the attorneys said, there's no way. I have been telling every one of my clients, stop all reasonable suspicion testing, because that's going to get you sued, and call it randoms. And I said, well, sir, I don't get to call out attorneys very often, so it was really fun. I said, you go ahead and you recommend that, and then as soon as any single employee understands that they were called in for a random drug test and there was no random selection, they were singled out and discriminated against, you're gonna get sued, and you're gonna, and all of the other attorneys on their call were like, oh yeah. How did they not know that? Because they don't know drug testing law. But according to DOT, which is our only rule of practice, a random selection must be scientifically chosen. You cannot draw names out of a hat. You cannot have an HR person pick. You cannot say 25%, so these 25 people and then those 25 people next quarter, and then you cannot do that. If the same person gets chosen 4 quarters in a row, too damn bad. It came through a generated, you know, scientific computer program. And I have people all the time, if you draw my name one more time in that random poll, I will quit and never use you as my drug tester again. Okay, it happened at the next place too. You just don't know. It's scientific, and it's blind, and it's double blind. So don't call a reasonable cause a random, and don't call a random a reasonable cause. They are separately defined, and they will be defined in your policy. It's an important thing. A reasonable cause, post-accident, define post-accident, what constitutes an accident. DOT has very, very specific definitions. You're a truck driver, you back out of the yard, you knock the mirror off the truck and do damage. They do a post-accident test on you that's DOT, that's a violation. That is a non-DOT accident. A DOT accident means that it must be on public property, not private property that the company owns. So it needs to be off company property. There needs to be at least one person cited in the accident, or one fatality with, with the driver cited and someone transported to a medical facility, or a fatality. So that's DOT, and anything else is non-DOT test. So you think about it, if someone's just bad driver and they get accidents and we're listing them all as DOT, then now DOT is opening up a federal registry so that you can see drivers' records, their drug testing records nationally for their next job. And it says 6 post-accident tests. We're going to think, were there 6 fatalities? Were there 6 people that ended up in the hospital? Right? It's very specific. So what is your definition of post-accident? A lot of employers define this by property damage. It's up to you. You decide if you're non-DOT. Okay, return to duty is you fail a test and then you get to come back to work after you've been evaluated, and then follow-up testing is if that happens, the substance abuse professional will dictate a series of random drug tests for up to 6 years, whereby that person agrees to stay clean and they agree to the terms, and most of the time they pay for the testing themselves. Reasonable suspicion, it's best if you have training on that so that you know what that looks like, you're aware of drug trends. Very, very important. You can do it online if you need to. Okay, so these are the definitions of each type of testing, which I have explained to you. Okay, so define how often will you run a random poll, annually, biannually, quarterly, or monthly. I've seen all of those. And they all work except annually. And the reason that is the case is because people who do it annually never think about it until December 15th. So call me up and send me out to a construction site, and I could say, or a whatever site, because this has happened so many times. One time I went to a road construction site and did a porta potty on the side of road construction, and everybody's got their fake urine in their pocket because they know it's coming. They forgot about it. Keep it in my pocket so it's nice and warm and body temperature. And they cheat, and they cheat, and they cheat. This is predictable. Random testing should not be predictable. One quarter, do it in January. The next quarter, do it in July. Mix it up. If you have 30 people in the pool, then do half of them at the beginning of the quarter and then spread them out in the middle and the end. They got to not be able to guess. Otherwise, it's predictable. They figure it out and they play by that. So who will make that determination? Who will run the random pool? I do suggest doing a third-party administrator, but an HR manager is fine. Again, you know, you may have to fight discrimination accusations, and then again, avoid the predictability. Okay, so again, I'm defining the types of testing. Okay, so who will determine what is reasonable suspicion? That person needs to be trained. Is it an immediate supervisor? You need to send them to training and invest in it. And when I say invest in it, I mean, you can get it for $100. Some are a little more, and they're worth every penny usually. But don't just get like a free slideshow on YouTube. Make sure it's thorough. And then what is your practice? So if you have reasonable suspicion, does it need to be verified by a second person? You really need to know that because some states require it. I think there's only like 2. I don't think your state's one of them. But if it says that in your policy, it needs to happen, which means if a supervisor determines and your policy says they need to have backup, they need to be able to get a hold of the HR manager or the contractor or whoever it is that's going to back them up and be a witness and is it a witness in the confrontation or just verifying that they see the same thing? What does that look like? What training is required for supervisors and what documentation is required? So please understand that we don't just take another employee's word for this and then do a drug test. Because false accusations happen all the time because someone's trying to get a promotion or they hate someone or whatever. You don't just take someone's word for it. That's part of the training is you must visibly see the signs and the symptoms, lay eyes on that person, whoever is the party responsible. And someone can report it. I had a girl call me, she goes, I just had an employee come tell me that she caught a coworker snorting coke in the bathroom. Can I do a reasonable cause test? Okay, that's a little different. I mean, you know, and it wasn't DOT, but man, it gets iffy. That really gets iffy because she didn't see it herself. Is it like she's gonna walk in that bathroom and catch her the next day? No. So yeah, it's tough. But that was a real extreme. That doesn't normally happen. Okay, well, we already talked about what return to duty is. How will you test? What type of test meets your needs? Is it urinalysis, hair or fluid? Are you going to pre-screen with the instant test? Are you going to do lab confirmation only if you have the pre-screen non-negative? And then what panel of drugs and you certified professional collector? So the panel of drugs, so this is an example of the entire collections process. We will have this, and we will have a chain of custody, and we will label the samples, and we will blah, blah, blah. Very detailed. You can go through that. You can choose to put that in there or not. You can also say we will choose to follow the DOT model of drug test collections as outlined in 49 CFR Part 40. It's a shortcut, but it would work. This is kind of extra, but if you feel like you're kind of in a litigious job, group of employee pool, then you may want to go into this much detail. Again, the integrity of the process, certified labs, instant result testing, what that looks like, confirmation, we will use GCMS, we will, right? You can go into great detail on this if you so choose. We will use these products. Now, this is where I want to park for just a quick second. This company will test for the following drugs. And so now you see this list of drugs, okay? So many policies have this, and they're like, we got 20 substances, we're good. I don't agree, because you must have this. Or you can list whatever you want. You can list Kratom, and you can list K2 Spice. I don't care what you list, that's fine. Or any other altering substances, non-medical use of prescription drugs or prescription medications not used by a pharmacist's instructions, or any other altering substance, you gotta put it in there. And the reason you have to is because drugs change. 6 months we got a drug on the market nobody's ever heard of before, and it's not in your policy. And this comes up, guys. Can I test for K2 Spice? Is it in your policy? No, we have these 5 things in our policy. No, not unless you change your policy and notify your employees, and then you can do it.
So if we use an outside source for doing that testing, and they have a panel of things, do they regularly look at that and update those?
Good question. If you use an outside source and they have a regular panel, yes, you can request a specific panel, and what you can do is you can say, we'll use your standard 5, 10, 12, 20, 28 panel. All those, there's 16 or 17 panel. You can use whatever they have as a standard, but we reserve the right to also test for these other things as needed, because a lot of those substances are not standards on a panel and they cost a little more. And the other thing is, you're not going to catch every drug in a drug test. There's some drugs that change so rapidly. K2 Spice has, I don't know, there's like hundreds of recipes for it, and they change, and as soon as we narrow metabolite and we can get a drug test for it, or a state makes it illegal, there's another one that pops up that we can't detect. So you're not going to always catch it, but one thing that you can do is the reasonable cause. That's why the policy said at the beginning, and or the signs and symptoms of, because unsafe behavior is unsafe behavior. And this policy is not defined by the drug test outcome, it's defined by the behavior and the nature of the safety of the workplace, the employees, and the customers, right? So that is very, very important to document the unsafe behaviors, because it could be a mental health problem. It could be stress, it could be something else. So maybe they need a timeout, maybe they need an evaluation, and it's literally not drugs, but they need meds. That could happen. So you don't just only rely on the drug test for employee health and wellness. Will you test for nicotine? There are tests out there, it's called Cottonin test. Will you allow e-cigarettes or vape devices? Ask yourself those questions, because there's many campuses that are smoke-free now, and so what will you include there? Again, we used to say, use the federal language, but the ruling in Rhode Island said that that was not enough. They said you can't just drop this in a policy and expect that that does the trick, because it may not apply to you. So it used to be a safety blanket, it no longer is. You can use it, but it doesn't just cure everything. Okay, so you need to know what your breath alcohol content limit is. And the reason I say this specifically is because different states have different limits. Some states a DUI is one thing, other states a DUI is another. So make sure you know what that is in your state. Are you going to have a lower tolerance for it? DOT even has different standards for different job descriptions, like pilots are different than over-the-road truck drivers. So you just need to know what that safety standard is and define it. Then the violations and consequences. What are the consequences of violating? What are the procedures for determining whether they violated? What are the procedures for appealing a determination? Are you going to allow an appeal? Which, you very well could. Are there second chances, or is it complete and utter zero tolerance? And can you do some type of suspension program? I used to say, zero tolerance only, I don't care. will not say that anymore. You need to be so careful. And I don't believe in case by case. I just say I think you need to probably consider second chances and what are those terms. Some companies are giving third chances. I don't know if I'd go a third. Maybe if it's a few years later, but I think because, and the reason I say that is because we're in an era where we got to educate people. They're hearing one thing, it's not true, they think it's okay, they don't understand, they missed the meeting, I don't know, but I think it's an opportunity to educate and help people do better. Maybe they don't want to do better, and you'll know that really quickly, but then maybe they do.
Is it problematic to have a tiered policy in terms of if you have a mix of safety-sensitive jobs and those that are not?
Is it probable to have a tiered policy for a mix of safety sensitive? No, absolutely not. You can define it, just define it. This is for the safety sensitive, this is for the non-safety sensitive. And then they need to know which group they fall into, okay? And by the way, even for DOT, if they are only in that position if they only do that job for like twice a year, that's their definition for the whole year. That's the DOT rule. So if they switch seats, are you going to let them switch what applies to them, or are they going to stick in one category? All right. Okay. This is just language for a consequence. Is it termination? Is it, what is it? And then are you going to do something different for applicant positives, first-time positives, refusals, tampering, suspensions, and verified positive results? Is the employee going to pay for the drug test if you allow them to do a treatment program? Again, I mentioned EAP, SAP before, how successful it is, how wonderful it is. But if you have someone that is going through the program, compassion is necessary, but so are boundaries. Support them going to their meetings. If maybe they need to go on lunch break, support that. But they better be back at the time they say they're going to be back and make it a reasonable time, or it's abuse. And you have to be careful with that because, trust me, I know people who have struggled with substances, they are so manipulative, so manipulative. Before they really have a good grasp on their recovery, oh my gosh, again, part of reasonable cause training is learning how to handle the manipulation. You're going to do this to me and my family? No, you did this to you and your family, right? You have to remember that and not get manipulated by these things. So support it, but don't get screwed around by it. You also if you're DOT, and it's a good suggestion for non-DOT, right here, the DOT rule says that if you have someone that violates the policy, you are required by federal law to provide them a list of resources if you do not have an EAP. So for those of you who raised your hand, you don't have an EAP, at the very least, you should be able to hand them a sheet of paper, even if you're firing them. This DOT says, again, good practice. You're firing someone and they're out the door, but you at the very least have a responsibility to hand them a piece of paper with local resources. An AA group, 800 line, a quit line, a substance abuse treatment facility in town, Department of Health, whatever that looks like. You find out what's local here. You can usually find a good list on SAMHSA's website, probably Illinois Department of Health. Print it out, hand it to them. For DOT, that qualifies as giving them the information they need, pursuing it as their choice, okay? So you don't have an EAP. Okay, and even with an EAP, you can do whatever you want to do as far as zero tolerance or not zero tolerance. It can be based on the recommendation of the substance abuse professional. Yes, they have a problem, they did something stupid, and they need to have a class and retraining, and we don't believe they'll do it again. Or this person has been classified and tested as an addict, and we need to take care of that. Okay, again, we've talked about ADA at length. MRO may provide a fit for duty exam. So where this comes in is if you have someone who has a legitimate prescription, okay? The lady falling out of her chair that was brought in for reasonable cause that I told you about, pulled out 6 pill bottles in front of me. I'm not allowed to look at that. Prescriptions are totally HIPAA, as you know. I'm not allowed to see that. I'm not the MRO, but she's going, could it be the Vicodin? Do you think it is the codeine? And I was like, ugh. And most of them were empty. And she's like, I only take 6 of those a day. She was wasted. But, oh my gosh, it's a whole other story. Don't have time for it, but you got to hear this. She passed the breath alcohol test. They brought her in for being drunk, and they said she's totally drunk. Well, there's no alcohol on her breath. But I couldn't get her to blow into the breath alcohol machine because she was so mortified. Even in her state, she was so mortified that they were accusing her of alcohol use that she started crying. So I would say, okay, ma'am, stand up straight, take a deep breath, and when the machine beeps, you're going to blow long and hard into it until it beeps again. And so it went like this. All right, ma'am, we're going to do this one more time. It was the most bizarre thing. We did 6 tries, but she was negative. So anyway, she was on all this other stuff. Okay, so then she said, I have a prescription. There's nothing you can do. And so the employer called, and we luckily, in that place, we had a medical review officer on site. And we said, do a fit for duty test. And Dr. Polanco can do it today, and he can determine if she's over-medicated or not over-medicated, or safe to do her job. That's where you get someone who's overprescribed or overusing. You do a fit for duty exam with a qualified medical review officer. And because you're close to the Chicago area, you have many of those that you can take advantage of. And so that's your way, and so the medical review officer will determine the nature of their job and their duties and whether or not their behavior is safe to work. And they are allowed to call the prescribing physician to work out the medications, or to recommend, treatment or whatever, or termination, whatever that looks like. So I don't think they recommend termination, but they recommend you follow your policy. So that there's so much value in the medical review officer. Always, always, always protect confidentiality and privacy in small environments. Of course, that can be very difficult because word spreads and we gossip. But you as an HR person or supervisor would never share that information. It's not water cooler information. Be sure you protect individual rights. Be sure you define your terms properly. Have the acknowledgement consent form signed, and then know what your reasonable cause checklist is. If you need a sample reasonable cause checklist, I will send it to you. I have a stack of business cards up here. I'm happy to send you a template. It's not like the perfect thing, but it at least gets you on the path of going, these are the reasonable, articulable, ostensible signs of substance use, and we saw this. Without the drug test, this is what we saw, this is what we noticed, and it was unsafe, and this is why we did the test. But if the test is negative, you still have this. So again, document, 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 document. Anyway, thank you so much. I'm here. I have cards if you have any questions. Thank you, guys.